I think Through Silver is an example, just like all our records, of us making the music that we needed to make to save us, because we fully believe in the power of music to save us. I mean, that's been why we're addicted to music and why we love music so much and why we've been following this musical path our whole life. Is music's the only thing that is really just going to give us the grace to get through the day and get through the moment. And so we were just trying to create the music that was going to save us that didn't exist.
Hotter than the surface of the sun.
1997 was a particularly trying year for me. I'd gone through a very, very hard relationship breakup. I had nowhere to live. I was sleeping on a couch. I was living in Boston. I was sharing an apartment with a bunch of violent derelicts that caused trouble every day. And I also caused my fair share of trouble too. That was also the year that I first saw Neurosis perform. And they were on a tour with I Hate God and Dead and Gone. And they played at the Middle East Downstairs. And I had never seen the band before. I'd heard about them. I was familiar with some of their records. But the Through Silver and Blood record, that was when they really went big. Like they were doing Ozzfest, tours of Pantera. They were just out there in a big way, constantly touring and, playing with bands that I never thought they'd play with, like Biohazard and, that kind of thing. So there was a show coming up. It was a night that I actually would look back on even to this day. And it's over 20, close to a quarter century later. That particular show still affects me. It's still one of the most intense experiences I think I've ever had at a show. Everyone was there. It was like it was the most important night of the year. Every single person I knew was at that show. I Hate God had played one of the best sets I'd ever seen them play. And, this is the late 90s. They were in full swing. Dangerous. They're smashing bottles. There was just like this very dark energy throughout the whole night. And when they were done playing, I was like, damn, Neurosis is up next, man. They got their work cut out for them. But when they took the stage, my whole life had been transformed. They started out with the drumming, and that right there just put me in this primal state, transcendent. These are some of the words I used later that evening when I was talking about the show with my friends. And it was one of the most illuminating evenings of my life. And ever since then, I've been a massive fan of Neurosis, and particularly Through Silver and Blood. And as the years went by, I learned that was a very difficult period for the band. And that record really captured, the angst, the darkness, the emotional despair, the struggle, that I believe they were all going through. And it's made like an indelible mark on my own life and has inspired me creatively to this day.
To say Neurosis has had some sort of impact on my being, that'd be a gross understatement. I've long admired their fiercely independent nature, both artistically and the way they've managed said art. Time and again, they have pushed themselves like no other band has, going into that unknown abyss and coming back to tell us about it. Through Silver and Blood is the quintessential representation of this. Spiritually painful, brutally honest, cathartic, punishing. It's crushingly beautiful. It's a genius piece of art. No debate here. Always considered to be one of their best, if not their best. They hit all the marks. Purify, Locust Star, those fucking Dave Ed vocals, love them. Through Silver and Blood. Simply amazing.
You just heard Locust Star live from Ozzfest in 1997 by Neurosis. This is the Rock Mail Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And this is the Through Silver and Blood 25th anniversary, part 1.
That nobody knew about.
Yeah, nobody knew about it. Not even Steve knew about it when we talked to Steve.
Until your email.
Yeah, and you just heard Steve actually before Locust Star too. So we'll explain what the hell we're up to here in a second. But we got a lot to unpack. We've hinted at it in the sentence show that you heard, hopefully, last episode, that this is amongst the most ambitious things that we've ever attempted. We're kind of in our peak skill set here with, history, art, the kind of two backgrounds that we sort of bring to the table and stuff there. So you also heard a couple testimonials, and we'll kind of talk about why we're doing that and, stuff that's going on there. Bruce Lamont from Yakuza and Mike Hill from Tomb. So thank you for those. But let's get a little business out of the way, then we'll sort of really dive kind of in. By the time we get to the end of this episode, I'll probably forget to do all this stuff. So, we're pretty pleased with what we're doing here. So if you like what we're doing and you think that stuff like this is kind of worth your attention, we think it is, please become a patron. Recently, you heard a couple samples of some older patron shows. If you kind of liked what you heard, it's a little looser format. Go to patreon.com/Requiem podcast or go to requiemmetal.com and you can click on the Patreon link there and, sign up $5, $10, whatever you can spare a month. I think that's more than, that's not.
Well, at this rate,
a couple coffees.
We're giving you, last month, it was probably about almost 10 hours of content.
Yeah.
Not including like patron exclusive stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which will be this. We're going to have some interesting
we'll
excerpts
have some,
and stuff left over.
We'll have some nice little things for the patrons that are exclusive to them from what we're doing here and stuff. So, again, please, we'll probably forget to do this at the end of the episode, but, we really do think that we're doing some kind of special stuff here with the Thrash series that we just finished. Hell, even Sentence turned into something I think kind of extra special too. So.
Yeah. I think we are. I think that our whole kind of Thrash series really kind of set us up to do like almost like college lecture circuits on all this stuff.
Yeah, here we are. Yeah, exactly. One thing I did release for the patrons as well that you can get access to, and we might be able to send it down the road through this normal feed. We just got to do some tweaking. But speaking of college kind of lecture-y type things, I did a 2.5 hour kind of lecture on the history of rock and roll, or at least the beginning history of it, for the Everything Borrowed podcast with a friend of mine. And it's pretty cool. If you like this kind of weird stuff that we do, you like historical context.
If you want to watch Jason on video?
Yeah. If you want to watch me on YouTube, which is weird, I can't do it. So I haven't really listened to it back because, I don't know, it's just weird. It's one thing if it's you and I and music mixed in. I can listen to our episodes because there's enough like other things happening. It's uncomfortable.
Especially, if you could figure it out pretty quickly and how, but but just like, I don't want to, if there's a camera on, I'm much too self-conscious. I want the lights dimmed. I want to look my best, Yeah,
I know. But I guess, I seem to be fairly unaware of the camera. So I guess I can't, from what I think you told me and a few other people that I just didn't even really bother with it there. But, so anyways, if you have some comments on these episodes, shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com or leave us a comment on Facebook, Messenger, things like that, Jason and Mark, or go on to Twitter, Requiem Metal Podcast on Twitter. We like reading letters. We actually got some really nice feedback from the guy we played his little audio thing last episode. He was pretty stoked that we did that on the Sentence show.
It sucks that there's like 1 second cut off the end.
Oh, was there? Yeah. It's kind of like an abrupt.
You get the point.
Yeah. So anyways, that's our kind of housekeeping stuff from my end in terms of how to get in contact with us, how to become kind of a patron and be a part of something I think we're about to kind of evolve and we're purifying ourselves. We're like a butterfly in chrysalis here, so we're doing some cool things.
This episode's done some stuff to us.
Yeah, we're different now. So, but Mark, you have something you want to also mention that's kind of part of the metal community.
Yeah, a artist friend of mine, Justin Bartlett. He's done stuff. He did, I believe, people might know his stuff. I mean, he's done a bunch of stuff. The first time I became aware of his stuff, he was doing, I think, the first Decibel tour merch stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That was his art.
Did he do like the posters or the
I think
t-shirts?
He did the posters and the t-shirts and kind of the whole thing. And then he did a piece for my Celtic Frost book that came out more years ago than I even realized at this point.
Can people still get those? That and the Priest and the Merciful Fate?
Merciful Fate sold out of its second printing. I don't think I'll do another one, but those other are available. But he's unfortunately going through a pretty bad bout with cancer. And they have a GoFundMe that's up right now. They're looking to raise money for treatment. And so far it's done. It makes me feel good to see the generosity of the artistic community and metal community and in general. But if you just go to GoFundMe and look up Justin Bartlett Cancer Fund, I'll put a note in the show notes.
Yeah.
About
Is it B-A-R?
B-A-R-T-L-E-T-T.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
And
like
also
President Bartlett from West Wing.
Yes. But yeah, if you can, or there's been a little, I think there's a write up on Decibel or whatever as well. But yeah, if you could throw a couple bucks his way, it'd mean a lot to him. And unfortunately, we're the biggest country in the world without any kind of like universal health care. So if we can help our fellow artists out, this is what makes the world worth living in, is art and music and books. And
I feel like artists are one group, artists and musicians, and people are one group that are notoriously non-covered.
Yes, it's like a risk you got to take.
Yeah.
So
wrestlers too.
Nobody wants to insure them.
They go through Lloyd's of London. That's who you. That's how you.
Okay.
That's how you get insured with like WWE and stuff like that. But yeah, it's weird.
And I'm not sure of his specific situation.
Sure.
I know a lot of artists that do not.
Well, we were asking patrons to put you under their care, right? That was
I have since got some, but it's not great. But it's like what
it's something.
It's something.
Yeah.
So I can't worry about that right now.
Yeah, so that's a great cause. So please do that. We appreciate that.
And they've just in a couple of days they've raised $21,000.
Holy cow, that's awesome.
Cancer treatment's not cheap.
No.
And if you don't have insurance,
quick.
then I went to the dentist without insurance, and they said, "Oh, well, it's 50% off then," and I paid cash. It's
Whoa.
I see how the industry works now.
Yeah. The prices are set almost by the insurance companies more than anything. So this is interesting. We are doing 2 parts. All right. So let us kind of give you the thesis of sort of how we're going to proceed here, because it is it's different. I've seen other podcasts do similar kinds of things of what we're going to do. A lot of times it's just clips, but we're going to play mostly full songs. There's a few songs we'll probably fade in and out because they're longer pieces and things like that. But I kind of had wanted to sort of look at where, through Silver, we'll talk a lot more specifically about that record on part 2. But in part 1, we wanted to look at the sort of music that influenced Neurosis, and also just kind of talk about the history of music that goes to the places that Neurosis goes to, these kind of emotionally vulnerable, kind of frightening places at times. And that was something we talked a lot about the last time we did a Neurosis episode with Sun That Never Sets, just, how songs like Stones in the Sky or Falling Slowly, they kind of get you, in the interview that you'll hear parts of in part 2, I was talking with Bill from Mastodon, and we kind of were both kind of commenting that nobody's like a casual Neurosis fan. Like you have to be all in, because they are very serious about their art, and
it's demanding listening.
Yeah, really, you can't just like put it on in the background. You can, but it's like you're not really going to get it,
Yeah.
I did at times just to sort of let it kind of permeate through me a little bit, because I wasn't quite prepared to like start writing notes about songs. I needed to like.
Yeah, but you're almost like, priming yourself before you're going to do the full plunge, really.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But it's not something you hear like when you're at H&M buying clothes or something.
You don't put it on at like house parties.
No.
You can if you really want. If you want everybody to leave, you could.
Or everybody end up crying and telling each other their problems and just having this cathartic religious experience.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And we've talked before that Neurosis kind of does go to places where I equate it to like, on my own level, like a type of spirituality. And that's something that, we had a chance to interview Steve Von Till and Noah Landis from the band, and
which is a first for this show. We've never done an interview together. You did you interview the guys for Hard and Heavy, or was that something Albert just sent questions? I can't remember. That was you. I Skyped with all those guys. You Skyped them,
okay,
and then I had to do a lot of editing to make it. But that was more of a joke. Or kind of like not even a joke.
It was a fun. That was like lighthearted. Like it was celebrating.
It was a thing that really meant
cool.
a lot to us, and we're trying to kind of like put a little focus on it.
Yeah.
But this was much more of a. I feel like more of an academic pursuit.
This felt like I told Mark I was felt like a Godfather 3. They're pulling like Pacino out of retirement. Once they pull me out, I'm back in or whatever. Like I haven't really done traditional types of interviews since the Eclipse days, which was in college, and so
but the last 10 years of the show have kind of like built up all
Yeah,
those.
I still have like the
critical thinking skills and
the
stuff.
chops for it. I think it was like a weird, like riding your bike for the first time. You know, it came back to me.
Well, and all the teacherisms too. Like
Yeah.
that's a big part of that.
Yeah, it's knowing how to run
people
discussions and like pull things out and stuff. So,
and Noah's kind of notoriously not a big interview guy.
and he was
we
incredibly
got some really
talkative.
cool
Yeah.
stuff out of him. Some really some stuff I've never heard anybody specifically talk about, which was cool.
Yeah.
Which is something you always want to try. If I'm going to go do something I don't normally do, if I did interviews like every month for magazine, whatever.
Hey, how's the tour?
Yeah. But even like just more
That's what a lot of
general
interviews
stuff,
sometimes.
you got to
Not
kind
us,
of craft the whole thing. And so we had a bunch of questions, but it kind of, you kind of have to have the interviewees be the one that kind of like pull you in different
guide you.
directions.
Yep.
And I think to be respectful to them too is you got to prepare a lot and then just kind of let them do their thing, and kind of like, nurture it along or see like where they're comfortable talking, where they're not.
Yeah, and I think with Through Silver, so much has been said about this record. It's celebrated pretty openly by lots of people. Decibel did a whole Neurosis issue, and it was one of the 3 Hall of Fames. I think the challenge, I think, for both Mark and I was, as you just kind of brought up, like, what can we do to bring something new, to this, where we're not just kind of treading over the same ground that all the other interviews from Neurosis have sort of gone through and things like that. And so, I put my history hat on a little bit, my context hat, what I'm kind of good at. And Mark, is kind of crafting the sort of artistry on his end of like how things should sound and flow together and doing a lot of cool things with the interview clips and stuff. And so I think we're kind of combining those elements in the best of both ways. And it was cool. It started with, I reached out to Albert Mudrin from Decibel and just kind of said, hey, like, do you have any thoughts on this? We're doing a Through Silver and Blood episode, and I just realized it's the 25th anniversary, so that's kind of cool. And just if you have like a little testimonial or something like that, and then I just kind of started thinking, oh man, it's 25th anniversary. I bet there's probably a couple other people that might be interested, and so I kind of threw some things out, and it just kind of snowballed.
Yeah.
I was talking to Chris on the phone last night, who a regular friend of ours who's on a lot of these episodes. I just said, it started like a pebble and just kind of rolling down a mountain. So just kind of picked up some speed or whatever. And so, people like Mike Hill and Bruce Lamont and others that you'll hear sprinkled throughout, not just this episode, but probably more in part 2, where we really are more focused on the actual Through Silver record. But the more people that kind of came out of the woodwork, I was like, well, this could be something cool,
Yeah.
And talking to Steve too, I'm sure it comes up in some of the interview clips you'll hear in the 2 parts. Like, he didn't even realize it was the 25th anniversary until I reached out to him, and he was like, "Oh, okay, yeah."
There's some good.
They're very humble, which I get. They're not.
Yeah.
They're looking forward more than looking back, which I appreciate and stuff. But
yeah, they understand this was kind of like a transformational record. In their career too.
And I think they were building towards it, and we'll talk about that throughout this episode. But they achieved something kind of. Untangible a little bit, or intangible. And that's kind of what makes this special. And so that's kind of where the approach is we want to take is, where did music that is in the realm of Through Silver come from, and where did Neurosis come from a little bit? And we're not going to do like the normal discography kind of like, we're not going to go a lot into, actual Neurosis records, but we are going to sprinkle some songs from the Through Silver era throughout this episode, linked in with other bands that were influential either directly on Neurosis or kind of part of the same mentality or the same philosophical approaches or
kind of singular approaches to.
Yeah, that was a word that Steve brought up quite a bit, and probably Noah did as well, that the bands that they were drawn to were very singular, or bands that were able to sort of tap into something that was emotionally intense. Because Through Silver is a pretty harrowing listen. I mean, it's not an album I can even go to as often as, say, like A Sun That Never Sets. That's a calmer listen for me. I have to be in a kind of a type of mood to really want and listen to all of Through Silver,
Yeah.
And they talk about that. The album, it takes a lot out of them in certain ways when they were recording it.
Well, because I don't really know how much. I mean, I've heard this before, but maybe not as succinctly said. is how physical, like it's not just the emotional burden of what was exercised in the record, but they played that's the most they've ever toured through that cycle.
Yeah, like 200 dates or something.
And
crazy.
like physically putting all that effort into it. Like that's why you don't play that stuff, because they hold themselves to a high standard for physical, like the physicality of the music has to reflect the emotional intensity of the music.
Yeah.
So it's like, I get it. You know, guys in your 50s, you don't want to completely like leave it on the floor every night.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like also as you age, that's not really I don't think that's not as big of a deal. It's not as satisfying to do that, I don't think, unless you're like maybe an athlete or something. But like for a musician, you want it to be kind of like the whole. I feel like watching these guys play is like watching jazz, watching friends of ours in Northwoods Improvisers.
Yep.
It has that kind of like overall vibe to the whole thing. It's almost like a little religious experience. It's not just purely watching it's like them, commuting their emotions out to you. And, it's just like this weird mix of, feelings and
absolutely.
energy.
Absolutely. And as we're about to kind of go into this, I will say before I kind of forget that I do want to send a special thanks to one of our patrons, Brian Wendorf, who people know because he is the one that has kind of...
he's the Spotify guy.
He has put together the Spotify history of Requiem History of Metal playlist. And he is, hosts. He's in charge of the Chicago Underground Film Festival, and he's older than us. I think he's got a decade on you. Even I think he's mid-50s, and so he's, he grew up in this kind of hardcore punk goth new wave kind of thing. He was
a teenager in the early 80s.
Yeah, and so I kind of reached out to him and said, "Hey, we're doing this thing. Like, would you mind like helping? I want to send you some songs that we're kind of thinking about doing. Are these the right songs?" And he basically said, like, I think you've made the good choices. Try a couple of these. And so a lot of his input really kind of helped guide some of the kind of ideas that we sort of tried out here. And, and I would kind of send like early versions of this to Mark and kind of see what his thoughts were. And then he, you would give me feedback and we tweak some things. And so it's been a really cool collaborative process. And this is the kind of stuff, like obviously putting together something like the history of heavy metal, like, this is the shit I love. I love like building playlists. I love like curating like moods and creating like, that's what I do as a teacher. I'm essentially presenting, a sequence of events to like kind of scaffold to get us to like this ultimate place of understanding, what I mean? Or something like that. And so this is kind of like, put me in, coach, I'm ready to play kind of thing. It's really fun. So
well, it's been nice just to, I didn't really have any expectations going into it, or nothing firm where I wanted to be like, this is what I want it to be. Yeah. I was like, which I've just maturing, like kind of let things be as they're going to be and kind of like put in what you can. It's everything works out better.
Wabi sabi.
Yeah. It's like,
I don't, Taoists say.
I don't want to be like, oh, this is bigger than I thought it was going to be and I'm going to do all this extra work. It's like, no, this is like an important thing.
This is like, we probably won't do something like this again.
Well, anytime. Yeah. But this is this is a nice hill to climb right now, I think.
And
especially
Neurosis
during
is
this pandemic.
Yeah, we got free time. There's not a lot of social shit going on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, the weekends are pretty much whatever.
But I think during hard times, let's do something worthwhile. This could be listened to in 30 years.
Yeah, I think, I'm kind of honored. I think especially once we hooked up with Steve and then, we interviewed, Aaron from ISIS and Hydra Head and Bill from Mastodon. Once you start kind of talking to those guys, you realize like, fuck, we can't half-ass this. You know what I mean? Like,
it's
like, okay, it means something to these guys now because we've now involved them. We can't just like wing it, and just kind of pull stuff out of our butts a little bit.
Well, I think the last Neurosis show we did was kind of like that was
a big breakthrough.
It was a big breakthrough, but that's kind of where I think we're beyond that right now.
Yeah.
So like we can have the emotional kind of, because that was one of my favorite shows we've done in a long time. Mm-hmm. But I think this is going to be a similar thing, but only just bigger.
Yeah.
And
I think like when I thought of like how to, like, I think now that we're wiser, having gone through like a few more years, something like how the Proto Metal series was done, that was very low key and fun and kind of laid back. But I think like, if you had like endless amounts of time, that could be similar to like what this is, right? Like in terms of like building the story of that year or something like that.
Yeah.
We did it, but it was very loose and relaxed, and I wasn't like researching the history of all, you know what I mean? Like, but I think like in my mind, like that's probably what I imagined wanting that to sort of be, but we weren't really ready to do stuff like that yet. It was still ambitious, don't get me wrong.
Sure, but then but that you had different social obligations too.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think if you the more the takeaway for me for 2020 is open yourself up to possibilities of things, because as soon as I do that, like it's just good stuff's happening.
For sure. Yeah. No, that's great. That's a great place to be. And I mean, I think Neurosis would say this is the album they kind of had to make, as Steve said, you know, and I mean, I feel the kind of same way. There's something like about going into like the eye of darkness, but like confronting that and then coming out stronger kind of in the end almost. And I think there's something about kind of doing this. So,
this also, real quickly, I think, cemented how, because you always hear like, you know, the band is a family kind of cliche. And by reading a bunch of interviews, watching all kinds of documentaries and stuff on YouTube, and then doing the actual interview, how real it is. Like their bond is way beyond. Like I understand why they. It's like it's like if we had four other people involved in the show, because I get the same kind of stuff out of that they get out of out of the show that they get out of that. So it's.
Well, and like I reached out to Jeff Wagner because I knew he was working with you at Relapse at the time that Neurosis got signed to Relapse through Silver and Blood. And, you know, he didn't have a lot to say, but he did say like the one thing he was always impressed about with Neurosis is they were living this. Yeah. Like there was no gimmick here. You know what I mean? There was just
no pretense.
They were just living it. Yep. And I thought that was succinct and
that's
stuff.
That's because anybody that was a hardcore DIY punk guy, whatever they went or lady for that matter, like go on to do, there's a certain like level of verisimilitude or just truth to whatever they do. Like they can't bullshit. And we know there's a friend of ours who's in I don't know, he works for a university now, but he actually did Tim O'Brien.
Yeah, Tim.
He's got that kind of like no bullshit. He does a great job. Like he's like an honest, good dude. You know where you stand with him. Like I feel like those kind of people that came out of that DIY scene have this certain kind of like brotherhood ethic. For sure. More so than a lot of other people that I know.
No, I don't disagree. Tim, I always trust he's going to be honest with you. Tim, we've talked a little bit about him, but patrons will know he's the one that kind of helped us clean up some of those interviews from the Eclipse days, the Chuck Schuldiner interview.
Chuck and Isan or something, I think.
Yeah, the Chuck one's the only one we posted, but we have some others. In fact, I think there's a Mastodon one that we can post down the road. Yeah. Those files are on Google Drive. We just got to like look at them. They're saved and shared between. I know, I forgot. It was a few years ago when we first started Patreon and we didn't have any Patreon content. I was like, well, let's do this.
My organization skills are getting better, but
there's
notes upon sticky notes upon.
If you look at my
dry erase
my
boards.
classroom is insane. It's just piles of papers everywhere, and it's like all these different.
It's thoughts. That meme of Charlie from It's Always Sunny. Yeah, that's like what my office looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess when you kind of start to get into this, I'll sort of lead us down there. You know, I mean, I'm not going to give the entire history of music here or anything, but I think when you start to look at like tent poles of where emotionally kind of intense music sort of comes from, you have to kind of look at the quote unquote art rock scene that emerges in the 60s. Post Beatles and Dylan and some of that stuff, bands like The Doors and Velvet Underground and eventually the Stooges and some of those bands that will emerge.
Television.
Yeah, I think, Television I'd kind of put more, they're like towing the line between art rock and early punk, Patti Smith and things like that. But I think you can kind of like go to a place like Velvet Underground with like kind of their atonal landscapes and like kind of dissonant chords. You've got John Cale's viola, you've got Lou Reed with this sort of visceral language that was pretty new for rock and roll. I mean, you had like visceral language from Dylan, but like the darkness of Velvet Underground about heroin and death and S&M,
but also
and things like that.
I think an interesting thing about, not to go too far into just Velvet Underground, but how you've got John Cale, who's this very like classically trained.
Yeah, he was like working with like Lamont Young and some of these like weird abstract kind of classical musicians.
But then you have like the Mo Tucker, and even
she's like primal.
Yeah, even Reed, they're kind of rough around the edges. That's more the emotion than like their ability.
Well, like a lot of Lou Reed's like use of language came from like pulp film noir
Raymond
novels.
Chandler novels.
Yeah, he loved like Chandler and things like that. So in a lot of ways, like Neurosis is this kind of like meeting of like visceral sludge doom with like art theory too, right?
Yeah.
Like they're kind of like combining, but with also like it's not so like intellectual that it's like inorganic either. It's like
emotional honesty.
It's so organic, almost in a way. You know,
I think it's that's one of the things about this record that makes it so unique, especially for. I mean, it's the thing that made me really pay attention to them more. I heard earlier stuff and I was just like, oh, I thought I kind of knew what it was. But this really has, you can listen to it on an intellectual level, but you can just listen to it at an emotional, visceral level. Yeah. Like just the music itself without the lyrics have that power, but then you have to put the lyrics and the visuals on top of it. And it's even more, which is the, kind of a hallmark of great art.
And I think a lot of the bands we're going to be playing throughout this part one kind of fall into that camp where they're not necessarily easy listens, and you can listen to them for a multitude of reasons. Like you can listen to them for just musical stuff, or you can really start to like, scratch the surface of the lyrics and kind of see where they're going to some kind of dark places. And we will talk about, some of these lyrics.
They offer as much as you want to get into.
You can go as deep as you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can just listen and that's cool, but you can completely immerse yourself and really get the experience.
I think another band, and in fact, the Doors, Jim Morrison saw a performance of Velvet Underground, and that's what sort of changed him musically. And they were all film students at UCLA, all the Doors were. And I think when you look at, for whatever your opinions on the Doors are, I think Morrison's an incredible vocalist and an incredible stage performer. I think he's a kind of hack when it comes to lyrics. I think he's been given like more credit as I think he sold himself as a poet in a way. And I think he's good at, but he's great at, his stage presence is what inspired Iggy Pop. So you have to kind of like say like, cool.
And he has some inspired moments.
For sure. And I think when you combine like some of the things that were like amazing about the Doors, you get a song like The End. And I think The End, we're not playing it, but that's a song, if you haven't really like ever kind of sat and really listened to it because maybe you dismiss the Doors, I get that. I went through my Doors phase in like 9th grade, me too. As all people do.
But then a couple years ago I went and bought the records because it's like I really like a lot of this stuff really connects with me.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that song in particular has like this whirling dervish kind of quality to it that's very spiritual, but also very terrifying. Like, that the music in the end, if you're familiar with it from how it's used in Coppola's like Apocalypse Now during the sort of slaughtering of Brando scene, spoiler, sorry.
It's like 45 years old.
Exactly. But, it gets very frightening and very intense. And I think that's the point of it is it's music that sort of builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And if there's kind of a component of Neurosis that people, often, say about them, it is that sort of quality of the kind of the build.
Yeah.
So I think you can kind of see bands like Velvet Underground and, the Doors and some of that early stuff as kind of very much kind of tent poles and things like that. But I think the first thing that, like, for me really goes to kind of a new level of intensity and almost like an anguish and sort of pain. And I know that we're going to be talking about the Swans a lot more later in the episode, but I think even Michael Gira kind of talks about, and I think in this interview clip with Steve and Noah, we'll talk about Pink Floyd, and he acknowledged it as well. Because I brought up how like a song like the live version of Careful with That Axe, Eugene from Ummagumma has this moment where it just kind of quietly builds and builds and builds. And then I believe it's Roger Waters. I don't know that assuredly. It could be.
It is. I saw the video.
Okay. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's him, but he just unleashes this like cathartic, like just scream. And, so I think that's kind of like a place that you sort of have to go. It's this rawness and things like that. And it, takes 3 minutes to sort of build there, but then it like just does this instantaneous mood change that kind of comes upon you. And I think when you listen to like Neurosis music, you have these moments where like they go from obviously the quiet loud or the soft, and that's a huge component here. And the build, it's this anticipation and things like that. And so
repetition.
Yes, yes.
That's very important.
What is? I think he'll say it like, I mean, if you do something 16 times, imagine
64.
Yeah, they'll bludgeon people and things like that. So
yeah, it says basically it turns into shamanistic music.
Yes. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a good portion. We'll fade out. Careful with that Axe Eugene live from Pink Floyd. I think is kind of a starting spot. We started with Locust Star. We didn't really acknowledge that. We'll talk more about them being part of Ozzfest when we get to Through Silver. But that was we're going to play most of Through Silver on part 2. So we just thought, let's start with something from Through Silver, but isn't like the traditional song. And it's a good recording too. That was if you ever go watch some of the live videos of them performing at Ozzfest, and you'll see like
it's great.
It's just intense.
The
physicality that Mark kind of referred to before. So we're going to listen to Careful with That Axe Eugene from Pink Floyd. Then we've got our first big Neurosis kind of interview segment. And I think this one kind of lays out the influences and some of the thesis. And a lot of the bands that he mentions here are bands that we're going to be kind of taking you on the journey through. So, so enjoy Careful with the Axe Eugene live from Pink Floyd from 1969, Ummagumma. All right. As a world history teacher, I'm always interested in kind of like sometimes the non-music related influences like film, history, literature, philosophy, things like that. And I know that you've alluded to some of that when it comes to like writing some of these records like Through Silver. But are there some things like in this era that were shaping the band kind of beyond music?
Absolutely, man. I think we had started that kind of quest, a couple albums before, but it was just getting clearer. We were definitely influenced by a lot of both psychological and psychedelic and spiritual philosophies. We were kind of combining wisdoms of indigenous people and native religions and earth-based spiritualities from around the world with kind of a Jungian psychology of the archetypes, and especially with regards to how we would incorporate the visual element with the music, if kind of combining it, like not only hitting people with Jungian archetypes and things that made them feel things, but also kind of a rapid fire hypnosis, breaking down the barriers to let the music in deeper. And just trying to frame, the personal experiences in the macrocosm. How is it looking at it from the species point of view of our relationships to spirit and soul and the planet and each other, and those types of things. Just really bringing in more of a philosophical element. Like I think Noah could probably speak to it as well. Like some of the samples you grabbed to put on there was like Robert Bradshaw and Joseph Campbell.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're all coming from our punk rock lives, and so I think the things in our lives that even led us to that, to choose like this kind of sort of fuck the world, sort of nihilistic philosophy that sort of drew us there, and along with a lot of other sort of broken children and neglected youth. I think that there was a vacuum there, and of anything spiritually meaningful.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of desperate to find that, and the only way we could do that was to make it. And so we all were sort of, deep thinkers, even as young men. And we all kind of found our own interests in things, and, whether it's like, Steve studying Norse stuff and David and learning Kabbalah, and I sort of got into Eastern philosophies and things like that. But we were all just sort of visiting all of these sort of ancient, schools of thought and wisdom and spiritual kind of search for meaning,
Sure.
And so somehow we just really knew that we were making it for ourselves, and so there weren't any real rules about how to kind of like mix it up together, and kind of use that as like a conduit to kind of like channel our music through, and so that's sort of how it sort of naturally evolved. It was, it's just young men kind of searching.
And I can relate. I think Mark can as well, because we were in college together. That's where we really met in a big way. And we were always like poking around into different things, whether it be film or music or historical things, and passing books around. And we both worked at a record store, and our manager was feeding us all kinds of things to think about and different philosophies. And I think
Sun Ra and all this stuff kind of
free jazz and Toru Takemitsu and just whatever,
Yeah.
and I think there's I think that's why we're probably drawn to a band like you, because we can hear that you guys are interested beyond just music. And I think like one thing I was commenting to Mark is I said there's something really almost like Buddhist about when I listen to like Neurosis, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I teach world religions and stuff like that. But like the idea of kind of stripping yourself all these things in order to find truth almost. And that's not just Buddhist, but that's what I kind of connect to a little bit. And I get that when I listen to Neurosis, you know, like when I listen to Falling Unknown and I almost start like tearing up or something, it's almost like my own spiritual thing that I think you guys do that a lot of bands didn't do prior to you. I don't know. Maybe that's too highfalutin, but it's just something I think about when I listen to you guys. And it sounds like you were trying to kind of move the music somewhat in that direction, if I'm not mistaken.
We weren't
maybe subconsciously.
Yeah. We weren't trying to move the music. It wasn't like, hey, I have an idea. Let's pull these things together. And make it music. You know, that wasn't what we were doing. It was kind of, the music was a tool in the paint box, you know? Mm-hmm. It was just, all of it was just tools to express. It was kind of an odd painting, actually. Our sort of at first limited abilities with the instruments and having how that like didn't even matter, you know? But sort of, I don't know, painting something that expresses yourself with whatever rudimentary tools we had. And this album in particular still felt very rudimentary in terms of us all kind of learning what we could do with these 6 strings and this like version 1 of a sampler, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When did it occur to you, I guess, that you had made something a little bit different than Souls or Enemy? Like, was there a moment where you kind of were listening to it as a band and you were like, whoa, we hit on something a little bit bigger than what we intended to do, or did it just kind of other people telling you that?
I remember some pretty like evil laughter in the rehearsal room when, you know, because Enemy is kind of where we discovered like, okay, this music is taking us into trance states, and by playing things in a repetitive motion and you know, by leaning things towards this spiritual direction, we are actually opening some pathways. And it was really touring Enemy, and especially after Noah joined, that we really started to break through that. And those lessons of playing those songs and augmenting things and taking things to a physical and emotional extreme. Like if 8 times feels really intense, then what about 64? You know? What if we, you know, poor Jason, but you know, like if we can just like be relentless about inducing the trance state to where we are leaving our bodies, then it's got to have an effect on other people, even though that's kind of our last concern. But it was definitely, I don't know, like I think we discovered a form of shamanistic magic by playing those songs off through Silver and Blood. And it was not easy. It was definitely hard on the body and hard to play those songs every night. But I remember sometimes where we were just looking at each other as we were writing it going, oh, that is not friendly. That is not, that is very not nice. And we definitely took probably our most, it wouldn't be nihilistic like our punk rock youth before that, but it was definitely our most, we're going to embrace the bad trip 100%. We are going to confront the darkness head on and dive straight in and actually become it.
Yeah. I remember, I think the sentence that we said fairly often was unfair to the listener.
That's great.
And I think at that time, Jason actually had tape on his drum carpet facing the audience that said front towards Enemy.
Yeah, because I mean, I think it was Mark and I were listening to some of the testimonials, and I think it was Mike from Tombs that said he saw you guys in '97, and it was just such a visceral experience that it changed his life in terms of how he wrote music and stuff like that. And so you were abusing the audience, but it was like welcome from them or something. It's like a connection.
Yeah, if you're ready to surrender to it, and maybe that brings you back to why you felt like a Buddhist connection. If you surrender, and there's some music you just have to. I remember being at a Merzbow concert in San Francisco, and the noise was fucking crushing. I mean, it was like really unpleasant.
Yeah.
But there was a pulse to it, and there was a guy who wasn't the main guy. He had a singer who basically was shaking a rattle for about 20 minutes before he said anything. And I just kind of realized, oh, this is shamanic music. This is like becoming the ocean. This is like, if you don't surrender, you're going to get sick and you're not going to like it. You've got to let it just happen to you.
Yeah.
And I think we noticed a lot of people commenting about that. If some people had to leave our shows, they felt sick. They got sick. I think maybe from the repetition and the volume or the intensity or the visuals or the combination of all of it. But those that surrendered to it, had probably experiences similar to we were having, delivering and kind of channeling the music, and
yeah,
that was a pretty incredible realization that we could be kind of channeling something that not only had meaning for us, but that had any sort of meaning for somebody else is kind of amazing.
Did it feel like too much responsibility? Like to that once you realized that, was it like kind of like, ooh, should we be doing this? Or was you're like, well, let's just lean in?
Lean in.
Yeah.
I guess along those same lines, the question I was going to ask, but you kind of already got there, is this idea that when you talk about this era, you talk about the idea that the listener needed to feel the kind of spiritual penance and the visceral physical penance that you guys gave to the music, and they needed to feel it on their end. Was that just a happy accident that you discovered later, or was that something you intended as you were recording it, or as you were just playing live?
I mean, I'd like to think that the audience is the last thing that we would consider, if we consider it at all,
Mm-hmm.
that, this is really self-centered music. I mean, it's really fucking weird and unpleasant music. And the fact that anybody else would get any sort of enjoyment out of it is kind of a miracle. But we, like I said, I do think that evil laughter did come from the like, oh, we can't wait to unleash this on the unsuspecting.
Sure.
There's another aspect, which is that when we're writing, we really very deliberately entered the process with blinders on. Like we were definitely not letting other big influences of us, like, jump in there and speak through our music. We're really trying not to do that and just sort of let our own sort of creative thing happen. So in terms of what Steve was saying about that being a very selfish kind of endeavor, like artistic endeavor, but then the other side of what we're doing is we're actually bringing all of this equipment into a room and inviting a bunch of people in there. And so that's when it becomes I think we figured out like ways of just, turning up the intensity of what that physical experience with other people in a room is going to be. And that's when I think the penance started to happen, and the shared gestalt or something.
Yeah. It's like an evil Phil Spector wall of sound or something,
I like that.
Yeah, there you go. Evil Phil Spector. It's funny because I was looking through the Decibel Hall of Fame that you did through Sue Silver, and I think it was Steve, you said that after kind of touring Enemy, you realized the trance kind of abilities of your music, and then in order to be truly heavy, you needed to remove these barriers. And then you commented that a lot of the heavy, dark music that's trying to be scary and intense was actually kind of a joke. And so you realized you didn't want to be like those bands. And I'm kind of curious what music around that time that you were hearing that was trying to pretend to be evil, that you guys were like, you know what? You want to fucking be evil? We'll show you what real fucking intense evil is. Was it like black metal that was kind of around in the mid 90s, or was there?
I don't think I was referring to anything specific so much as just like any of that. Yeah. I mean, you see guys dressing up like scary monsters or whatever. And it's one thing if they're not taking themselves seriously, but you see people dressing up and thinking that it's super evil, but it doesn't sound any more gnarly than Iron Maiden. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It just doesn't, like, I want to be, I think we wanted it to be emotionally intense, like Zounds, like Throbbing, Gristle, where you're really like, it's just real. It's not a fantasy book. It's not science fiction. It's not posturing. It's emotionally something deep and real. And not that we want to be, real, like, posing as street thugs starting a heavy metal band or something, but more like spiritually deep. We just want it to be emotionally intense. Like, does it make you feel something? Does it make you feel something real? Does it move you one way or the other? I think that's the music we were always attracted to. We like the music that sounded like it came out of nowhere, like Zounds, like Joy Division, like pre-Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd, or Black Sabbath's first record, like things that felt like they just came out of a fucking void of somebody, people doing something completely unique and doing something passionate and just putting their entire heart and soul into it. And so I think the only time we ever made a conscious decision to alter our sound was after Word as Law, when philosophically we were talking about these things we're talking about now, although in a younger, more primitive way. And we just realized, man, we don't sound like that. Like, we're talking about the soundtrack to the apocalypse and we sound like this. Yeah. That's not it.
Yep.
Boo-doo-doo-doo-doo.
Hey, those records are fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
No problem with those records. They helped us get where we're getting, but we needed to blow the doors off of it. We needed to, like the way Public Enemy sounded like riots happening in the streets. Like that sounded like shit was really going on and that you were hearing somebody singing right in the middle of it. And that's one of the kind of unsung, I think, inspirations for us to dive into samplers, was how are these guys using this primitive sampling technology to make things sound like hell, like when you're listening to a Discharge record and you've got the sound effects before the song, like, it sounds like an enormous door slamming in the gates of hell. Well, why don't you have that in the song? Instead of just like, the intro to it, and I think that was kind of part of it, was we just wanted to explore and experiment with how can we make the most emotionally intense sounds that we can. How can we actually embody sounds with a rock band format, basically, of the human experience, especially confronting the darker side of it.
It's interesting you mentioned Public Enemy because, like, as you say that, I was thinking of like songs like, Brothers Gonna Work It Out, which has just this soundscape of things flying at you from all angles, right? And it's like, it's very intense, and that's cool. I never would have thought of Public Enemy and the narrative of that, So I guess you mentioned Zounds and Joy Division. I've heard you mention before Killing Joke and Dead Can Dance, but were there bands, whether it be musically or at least like the aesthetics of how vulnerable those bands were, that did influence the direction that you kind of start to take with Enemy and especially with Through Silver? Because nobody sounded like this, so I don't think you were copying anybody, obviously. But I'm kind of curious what opened those doorways or gave you the courage to like really go for it, even vocally and the way how, I don't know, just how emotionally cathartic, everything that the three of you guys were doing and with the vocals and stuff.
We were listening to Amoebics a lot. I mean, this is sort of like before I was even in the band, I was just sort of always in the rooms because we were all just best friends.
I was going to say, you guys were all hanging out, right? Friends?
Yeah, we were just always spending all our time together. So, yeah, so I'm not sure, like, the sort of the specific way you asked that question might be more for Steve, like in terms of like in that time when you were like writing songs, what kind of gave you an example of somebody having a free path, you know, to make their own, right? I get the question.
Like when you mentioned pre-Dark Side, I was thinking of a song like Careful with the Axe, Eugene, where like there's that moment where that bellowing scream comes out, and that, I mean, that was really vulnerable and intense, you know? So that's kind of maybe what I'm thinking about, is those kind of songs or bands that were, like you said, opening the doorways. Or
For sure. Yeah. And that, again, it's those bands that sounded like they came out of nowhere, you know, the ones that were truly unique.
Yeah. I call them singular bands.
Exactly.
Because nobody else sounds like them. And it's everything from like, you know, Joy Division to even like The Cure is a singular band, you know?
Yep.
I can hear a lot of like pornography in some of those albums in Neurosis, for sure. Yeah.
Ones that come to my mind as being kind of important to me because they were sort of so hard on their own trip. There was a DC band called Beefeater, had a very sort of brilliant front person named Tomas, who was sort of philosophically and lyrically very just kind of mind-blowing. There's a band from Philadelphia called Ruin, who were very openly embracing their own search through Buddhist ideas and philosophies.
And if you're not familiar with that Fiat Lux record, you should seek it out and take it in.
Is that Ruin?
Yeah, Ruin. In England, there was a band called Zounds with a Z that were very vulnerable and special in a just a way that it just felt very kind of authentic and different from. They were part of this whole sort of crass crust anarchist English punk movement, but they just had a much more kind of introverted melodic take on it. So that was a really special album.
Rudimentary Peni.
Oh, huge. Yeah.
Rudimentary Peni. I mean, because they came out of that same crass. Yeah, they came out of that crass scene too, but they weren't doing anything political, really, except for 3/4 of the world are starving, the rest are dead. But you know, but such a psychological, psychedelic, hypnotic approach to primitive. I don't know. There was somehow a goth tinge to it, but it was just a 3-piece rock band doing this crazy hypnotic punk that was very different. It was outsider art for sure. And I guess, you know, that's probably what attracted us to it, in the same way that Throbbing Gristle was outsider art, or the same way that even the Amoebics, which Noah already mentioned, they were the only ones doing kind of openly spiritual, from a European English perspective, lyrics with kind of heavy metal guitars within that whole punk rock movement.
Yeah.
You know, and then even the Originators, which it took me years to actually really become mature enough to really let the message soak in, because when I became of age, the crust punk scene was, and the peace punk scene was already a generation past it. But Crass, they weren't pushing a singular agenda. They were pushing actual cerebral freedom and a lack of authority over your mind from any perspective. And their music is so incredibly original. It's so that came out of nowhere. I mean, you listen to those guitar parts, you wonder what the hell's going on. And I think they get written off as a primitive punk band, but it was really way beyond that.
One more band. Thank you for that, Steve. Both of those are huge. Peni and Crass. But one One more that comes to mind is Sonic Youth.
Yeah.
Like Sister and some of those even prior stuff, like Confusion of Sex and
I think Sister and Evil
Evil
were
was the one I was
huge.
thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, those were fucking huge. And then, I mean, Daydream Nation goes without saying. Those dark early ones.
Yeah, but even just the way they were kind of always a band that, I mean, as we got further on in the years of doing this and kind of outlasting most of our colleagues and our friends, they were always there, and they kept going in their own very unique, true to themselves path in a way that I think we always noticed and appreciated that, and had a certain admiration for Sonic Youth for doing that.
kind of like kindred spirits, even though you were in completely different scenes, kind of.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't even know if they have ever heard of us, so I don't know.
I'm sure,
but,
he's tight with Michael Gira, and I'm sure.
Yeah,
anyone that's into the Swans has eventually stumbled on Neurosis.
But Sonic Youth was and I think when we it was Souls at Zero, we first started using alternate tunings, and the only other bands that we knew of that I thought I had come up with it, because somebody left an Appalachian dulcimer in the house I was living at, and I tuned my guitar to it. And it turned into Dadgad, and then people were like, "Oh no, that's not a thing." Like Sonic Youth already has all kinds of crazy tunings, and Jimmy Page actually did half the Led Zeppelin songs you like in Dadgad tuning. But that was huge. I mean, the fact that just if the instrument is not serving what you're looking for, then change it.
You mentioned Swan several times, and they have so many different eras. Was there a particular era or that really was influencing you guys out of the crust thing into more of what Souls and Enemy and Silver were doing, or just a general fandom?
I personally, I like all eras of Swans pretty equally. I mean, that early super heavy dirgy stuff. I think I first probably got seriously into it before Souls, when I was kind of realizing that Word as Law sounded really weak, and that we needed to up the game. As my roommate had Children of God, which was kind of a later of the early period. That was kind of one of their breakout records after Greed and Filth, and so I went backwards and tripped out on it. But by the first time I got to see them, they kind of morphed into a more beautiful music type vibe, which I also liked quite a bit.
Yeah, because I can hear those elements in, maybe not through Silver, but certainly the stuff you guys did after. I can hear a lot of the Children of God or Words of the Light and stuff like that. Whereas I maybe hear Cop and Free Money? I'm trying to remember. But that mid-'80s era in maybe through Silver and Souls and Enemy a little bit more. I mean,
whatever. We're fans of all of it, and everything you hear or see, experience, read, watch is going to become some sort of influence somewhere.
Obviously, a long time ago, you heard "Careful with That Axe," Eugene, and then of course you heard Noah and Steve there talking for quite a while. That's the longest clip we'll be playing. Yeah, most of the others are. I don't think any longer, maybe 10, 11 minutes, but most are 4 or 5, I think. Throughout.
Yeah, we kind of, this is interesting because I went through and kind of edited everything out to topical kind of little chunks, and you couldn't really cut that thing up anymore. It just kind of felt like you need to hear the whole thing.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. So, and that was kind of what I was hoping. I didn't know when I asked that question, because there are times where they're kind of aloof about influences, and there's other times where they'll kind of openly.
I think it matters how you phrase it.
Yeah.
Because I think when a lot of people ask the question of influence, they think that, okay, this is because we sound this way.
Sound the same, yeah.
But no, it's what was the stuff that showed you this is possible?
The philosophy, the aesthetics, And I think that's important for folks. If you're just a metal person listening to our podcast, we're gonna go some weird places today. All right. So just be prepared for that. But I think the reason you're a fan of what we do is because you trust us and you know that we're kind of taking you somewhere. So this could be really fun for people who are kind of new to maybe, you know, punk or experimental music and stuff like that. So just, you know, keep an open mind, and I think you'll see where this is all sort of going. And I think maybe if you're not even that familiar with Through Silver, because there are probably people out there that, you know, maybe younger listeners or maybe people that, you know, time and time again, I remember talking to people or getting testimonials from people who were like, depending on what stage you were in your life when you kind of like got into Neurosis, like, you know, sometimes you're not ready for that record, you know, or any Neurosis record, you know. It took me a few years. I think I bring it up when I talk to Aaron Turner that ISIS helped me get into Neurosis. Mm-hmm. I kind of like, I knew who Neurosis like was, but I kind of went backwards, you know?
Yeah. Like I think that's why I like that. I respect the newer bands that kids get into that take them back to the old stuff.
Yeah.
Like that's just a rite of passage that's
have to. Yeah.
Is the longer you're in this kind of like, you know, musical discovery phase of your life. I mean, hopefully it's your entire life. Yeah. It just keeps you get deeper and deeper, and you're willing to figure out like, oh God, this is where maybe that came from. And it just expands your experience so much.
Well, and I think it mattered, you know, like, without a doubt, like listening to Dirt in 7th grade, like got me prepared for Sabbath. Yeah. Like I knew who Sabbath were from classic rock, but I didn't buy Sabbath.
You heard Iron Man on the radio.
Yeah, and Paranoid and stuff like that. Yeah. But like, I didn't know it at the time, but it was like meat tenderizing my mind with Sabbath riffs, so that when I encountered Sabbath, I was like, oh, this is the warm, okay, I'm connected to this. Or even like in magazines or even on Headbangers Ball, the t-shirts that people were wearing, you were like, oh shit.
Or the covers bands would do. Like,
why is Entomb wearing a Dinosaur Jr. hat? That's pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
So they're into Dinosaur Jr.? Huh. So it's cool for me to be into Swedish death metal and Dinosaur. You know, you have those kind of like conversations and thoughts.
Dismember in 1993.
Yeah.
And we were asking Matty Karki what he was listening to. Mm-hmm. And we were just on the floor that he was listening to Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, because we're kids. We're 15 years
you
old.
You just assume
old.
They're the hardest of the hard. That's all they're listening to. But they're like, in a lot of ways, bands like at that stage have cycled through that stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like Amorphous, when they start putting out like Tales, they're not like listening to like early demo finished death metal anymore. Like they're through that shit. They're listening to fucking like Emerson, Lake and Palmer riff or stuff, you know, or like prog shit, King Crimson. Like, they're just, and so are we. Think of where we were in college. We were like, we were still listening to metal, but we were really wanting to like push some other boundaries too, you know? And I think that's
completely.
Important.
Yeah. I think, metal may be made up. I mean, that's like the genre that I'm the most like viscerally connected to.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah.
But I'm so interested in all the other, like, that's when we did the big, you know, indie rock deep dives and more experimental stuff. That's when I really got into Radiohead and free jazz and all like all kinds of stuff. All the doors were open, and there's never like limitations.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was after. I can't remember if it was after Italy when I came back after 6 months, and you were suddenly like into jazz. But before I left, you weren't. And I just remember being like, what happened, dude? Because I would always talk to you about jazz a little bit, but I never really pushed it on you. And you're like, I think it was like finally like getting into Northwoods in a big way or something.
Well, our manager at the record store, Mike, was basically like, what is it that you like about heavy metal?
Yeah.
And I was like, the percussion.
Yeah.
The percussive. So he's like, okay.
Here's Tommy Drake or somebody.
Here, check this out. Yeah. Check out, I remember like the Albert Eiler stuff really got me right away. God, my recall for names is awful right now, but the
Art Blakey
was a big one for, because like people talk about who's the white dude that just goes nuts on drums that everybody talks about.
Boy,
the jazz guy.
Oh, like older. The guy who played with Benny Goodman. It's from Whiplash. It's the guy he's kind of modeling
that movie.
Oh, it's fucking great. Damn. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. No. Yeah, anyways. I'll have to look it up. That guy.
But he was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But Blakey was just like another level.
Yeah, for sure.
Or like, you know, hearing like Sun Ra Orchestra and stuff like he stirred me in the direction of the stuff I was already,
the weird stuff
that like clicked with me more.
So Mike did that with the Beatles with me.
I was smooth like, stuff. I was like, eh.
Yeah.
But the out there stuff is like, this is like the extreme death metal of jazz.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So that's what it made a whole lot of sense. And I was just really no responsibility outside of school. Mm-hmm. Everything was open to you. So it's like your brain is so, you know, kind of fertile at that point.
You're absorbing.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So kind of throughout the 70s, once you kind of work through your, your Pink Floyds and Velvet Undergrounds and Doors and some of those bands. And it should be said that, Morrison didn't just inspire Iggy Pop, but like one of the other guys, and he's going to come up later here, that was worshipped at the altar of Jim Morrison was Ian Curtis from Joy Division and stuff. So, I mean, again, I hear a lot of strong opinions about the Doors sometimes, and I get it because Morrison has this kind of ego to him, and he was a little kind of drugged out and flaky near the end. But
we were over inundated for a lot of like with the
like
Oliver Stone movie and shit. It was like, okay, we had a lot of years of just.
But I think with some distance, you can kind of start to appreciate the things that they were good at.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think you get bands like the Stooges. And I think another band we're not playing them, but I think a key band that sort of opens up some doorways is Suicide. In terms of the things that they did confrontationally, using electronics. Clearly you have all the German stuff that's kind of going on, whether it's, Kraftwerk or the krautrock stuff and Neu! And Faust.
And shit.
Yeah, and so you could kind of go into that a little bit. But I think all those bands, especially Suicide and Stooges in the 70s, are tapping into this kind of emotional intensity and raw power that could it was like this crippling vulnerability at times that was really scary and stuff and really intense. And then you kind of get into stuff like what we're going to hear with these next couple bands. I think it's part of what I think they referred to as the music concrete sort of scene. And you get Throbbing Gristle and, oh, hang on, I've got it, Mark. I got it queued up because I knew we were going to F this up. So I typed in how to pronounce...
Einstürzende Neubauten.
Neubauten, yeah, so it's...
Einstürzende Neubauten.
Einstürzende Neubauten.
There you go. So we nailed it. That's the last time we're going to say it. And those are, I think, two bands that kind of go to some kind of strange places. They're very confrontational with their music. Throbbing Gristle is this kind of early industrial sort of sounds with kind of swirling psychedelia. They're sort of like... oh shit, why can't I think of them? What's Lemmy's first big band? Hawkwind. They're like Hawkwind, but like bad acid. Hawkwind has this sort of swirling psychedelic quality, and it's funny because Hawkwind had a weird influence on punk. Henry Rollins was way into them. Even Joy Division, The Damned, they all talk about liking Hawkwind. Which is so weird because you would think that they would think that that's hippie-ish kind of stuff.
I think it's the DIY singular vision.
Yeah, it must be. So, but I think Throbbing Gristle sort of takes some of that stuff, but goes to sort of frightening levels with these sort of yelled vocals and sonic textures, whirring kind of sounds and buzzsaws, and it's the song that we're going to hear here, "Hit by a Rock." I mean, there's Stooges riffs kind of built into this, but it's cascade with all these kind of noisy aspects and industrial rhythms and
I think that that the krautrock stuff had a bigger influence than we ever really give it credit for,
especially on the art bands and the artsy
to show what's possible. Faust would make up their own instruments and just beat on
and that's something that Neubauten does. A lot of homemade instruments.
And I remember I was 14 or 15 when I got I don't even remember what record it was, a Throbbing Gristle record. I didn't really know what to think of it.
No.
I heard guys in Napalm talk about it, so I got that. And then I also got a Crass record because I knew how important they were. I didn't know I got actually an LP. I couldn't figure out what speed to play it on because I had no frame of reference for it because it was so. I think it might have been Stations of the Crass or something.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
But yeah, I was just I was interested, but I didn't. It was so hard to get into that.
Well, you didn't know how to be interested. You were interested, but you didn't know the access point.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That happened with me, Cabaret Voltaire. I have some of their stuff, and when I bought it, I was in college, and I was like, cool. I know I'm supposed to have this. I'm the first time I tried to get into Velvet Underground, I remember working at the record store and really kind of, it was almost like you had to do homework. I had to really sit and really think about Velvet Underground. I remember Kyle, who we worked with, he was working with me one time, and he was into hip hop, but he liked Pink Floyd and some other stuff. And he was just like, this is terrible. And I was like, but this is Velvet Underground. We sell a lot of this. He goes, I know, but I don't know why I would want to even get this. I go, I can understand that because not everybody has the energy to put into understanding art rock stuff. People listen to music for different reasons.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
acknowledge that.
And because As soon as I started listening to Velvet Underground, it immediately kind of hit because I think it's so like open
It's visceral.
It's visceral.
vulnerable.
It's like it's simple instrumentation, but emotional honesty that you don't. It's so emotionally honest that it's almost off-putting to people.
Yeah.
And I think if you're of a certain sensitivity level as being a shy artist kid, like I really kind of understood a lot of it. Like immediately kind of hit me.
I could see that. Yeah. I knew I wanted to like, and eventually I grew to love them. But I think for some reason, like Stooges and MC5 were like more immediate for me than Velvet Underground was. I don't know why. Maybe it was the volume, the speed.
Stooges
maybe?
was actually the one that I probably like the least out of all three of those.
Really? Even today?
I mean, I appreciate them, but it's not like immediate.
Okay.
You know, because like MC5 for some reason immediately
Yeah.
hit with me. Stooges was like, because I had preconceived stuff about, I want to be your dog and all this shit.
Yeah.
I do like it now, but it wasn't an immediate thing like
Sure.
those other two bands were.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I've grown through the years.
I like Funhouse better than anything else. But,
Funhouse is great. And I've even grown to really love like Iggy's like solo stuff. I think as I got into like
I like his
Bowie and things like that.
Yeah.
Because like
His
The
early
Idiot
stuff I did,
is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
The Idiot, that was like Ian Curtis's favorite record. That was what he was listening to when he hung himself. That was like playing in loop and stuff like that.
That's the Berlin era stuff.
That's Lou Reed, Bowie, and Iggy were.
Was that Transformer? Was that?
Transformer, and then Heroes, and that kind of era. Low, which is probably maybe my favorite David Bowie record. But
maybe that's why I've always really liked Bowie ever since I was a little kid. It was like seeing him in like Labyrinth.
I bet if you went and spent some more time with some of those Iggy solo records, it's probably been a while for you. I think
I've got The Idiot.
They probably hit you,
and even like the later on stuff was entertaining. But I really like where it's kind of an absurd proposition what they did with him.
Yeah,
he shouldn't have been a solo artist.
No.
But they made it work, and it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I mean, he's like in Carnival Cruise commercials now and shit like that. It's just Iggy.
Man, when I went on my only Carnival Cruise,
oh really?
Fucking Lust for Life. Every time you turn on the TV,
were they really playing that?
Yes,
it was like in the how it's like the hotel loop kind of stuff. That's
and I was
funny.
like, God, I almost hate this song now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Just remember, every time it's playing, Iggy's cashing out. Finally,
There's that, and the movie that was constantly being played was The Core. If you remember that, with Hilary Swank.
I never saw it, but I remember.
It's terrible. Okay. Don't ever waste your time watching it.
Yeah,
There's better stuff to watch. You got all this Criterion.
Yeah,
stuff
I got a lot of Criterion movies to get through. So with the Neubauten stuff, similarly, they're kind of using like industrial noisy elements to add like these kind of textures and make it a very harrowing kind of listen. In a lot of ways, they sort of punish the listener, and there's like this physical kind of catharsis. And I think Neurosis, as a philosophy, kind of understands like the toll of taking something out on your fans too. That like, and that's even going into Iggy's philosophy, and even going back to Jim Morrison, where he was going to Julian Beck theater performances, where Julian Beck was the first theater that kind of grew out of the theater of the absurd, where the theater actors would jump into the crowd and like confront and like cause like like shake people, and people were like, what the fuck, what's going on, and I think like Iggy took that to the next level and jumping into the crowd and things like that. So Neurosis didn't do that, but they did it through their music, almost like listening people. I think Steve talks about in one interview, people like vomiting at their shows because it was just so like intense.
And talking.
Loud,
I think it was in the last the full interview piece where they're talking about the like this is very unkind to the listener. Mm-hmm. And Jason the drummer would turn. He had a rug that had his drums on top that would say "point toward enemy."
Yeah. And I think that's something like do you listen to Throbbing Gristle and Neubauten and stuff like that just for like fun? I don't know. Maybe. I probably don't, but I'm like not the right person for it. This is not necessarily my comfortable scene, but I appreciate these bands for what they sort of do,
Yeah.
I'm sure there are like there's people that are into like industrial based stuff as we are into metal, right? Like,
sure.
And that's cool. It's just, that's a different thing.
It's a mindset difference, but.
And so we're going to kind of get into those. We got Hit by a Rock from Throbbing Gristle, which is off the D.O.A, the third and final report of Throbbing Gristle. That's the name of that record from 1978. And then Schmerzen, Horen from Neubauten's Kollaps record in 1981. Then we're going to sort of come out with a Joy Division song and the first of our old Neurosis songs. And we'll kind of talk about Joy Division and that first Neurosis song when we come back. That was Black from Neurosis's Pain of Mind. And then we have Day of the Lords from Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures, Schmerzen, Horen from Neubauten, and Hit by a Rock from Throbbing, Gristle. So Joy Division there, that's 79, so that's their debut record. And they're really only around for a couple years because spring of 1980, Ian Curtis hangs himself. And I just recently kind of got through a podcast where they were kind of talking a little bit about it. And thanks again to Brian Wendorf, who kind of turned me onto it. But No Dogs in Space is what it was called. And there's a lot of really kind of interesting things that I learned about the band. But in particular on Unknown Pleasures, the production was done by, I think it was their manager or a friend of the band named Martin Hannett. And he really took their sound in the studio and changed it a lot. From live, they sounded more like a traditional punk band of the late 70s, you know, what you would have heard from a British punk band, you know, from Manchester area. And but I think with what he does with Unknown Pleasures and the approach vocally that Ian Curtis kind of takes, you really get this emotionally kind of powerful, dark, kind of harrowing.
Well, I think like the Smiths and like, I mean, God, there's so many
Susan
bands.
the Banshees, all that stuff. The Cure.
That's such a important band in the. If you had to trace back, like, and the term goth music is not something. It's different to different people.
Yeah.
But when I think of goth music, I think of Fields and Sisters and and Susie and the Banshee, like that whole like the 4AD scene to some degree, and nothing later on weird industrial stuff doesn't really fit in that. But as far as that, like, that might be the first scene, like Joy Division might be the first just open nerve, emotionally like, I don't know anybody that has ever heard them that didn't like them.
Yeah.
As long as you're honest with yourself.
If you're open to things.
Yes.
Yeah. If you're open. If you're into being sort of challenged and stuff.
Like they might be one of those like really big linchpin bands that I never even really thought of until now for some dumb reason. But
yeah. I think they're kind of the Velvet Underground of the 80s in a lot of ways. Velvet Underground had so much influence on so many different scenes, even if they weren't necessarily selling a lot of records.
Yeah.
They get into like some of the reasons why Joy Division maybe at the time wasn't as popular. One of the reasons is they had this kind of belief that if you release a single and then you release an album, the single's already been put out, so don't put the single on the album. So like some of their strongest songs were only singles that never showed up on their two kind of records that you bought. So a lot of people could hear their songs on the radio, but unless you like recorded it off the radio, you couldn't hear it at home. You know what I mean? Like Level Tear Us Apart and things like that. Those didn't show up until like collections of songs came together like later on after they were broken up or after Ian killed himself. So they kind of
in his early 20s too, wasn't
he? Yeah. I mean,
it's pretty incredible. Think especially at my age now, mid 40s, thinking of the incredible shit that people did at that age and then they're no longer here is kind of crazy.
I mean, he made a pretty huge impact in just a few years. They weren't around that long. And the thing that, I learned a little bit about them, and I'm sure you remember, because I think you said you've seen the Control movie, which I haven't seen.
Yeah, there's a documentary as well, but I can't think what the hell it's called.
Yeah, I know the doc you're talking about, but the band was really ignorant, and I think it was a lack of maturity. And I was sort of bringing this up that the band themselves didn't really pay attention to Ian Curtis's lyrics very much to realize like how much personal meaning was in those lyrics and
how much he was struggling.
Yeah, the sort of call for help that was sort of there. And around the same time, I think it was right around the time of recording Unknown Pleasures or maybe touring it, is where he developed like epilepsy. Yeah. And he almost died on stage so many times and stuff like that. And then there's these crazy stories where he would like collapse on stage for like a half hour and they would like call the hospital, and then he'd like come out and finish the sets, and he shouldn't have been doing that. He should have really gotten more medical attention. He shouldn't have been touring the way he was, but he felt like he was
drugs the way he was.
Yeah. I mean, he felt like he was going to like let the band down in certain ways. And so nobody in the band had the maturity to kind of like put a stop to it and say like, maybe we should take some time off so you can get yourself like healthy and cleaned up. And like the band never, like I said, paid attention to the lyrics at the time and didn't really realize that stuff. And, I kind of equate it like their mishandling of some of that kind of stuff to, I think, when you hear the stories of like how Metallica handled like Mustaine, like they didn't really have the maturity to like know what to do. So they just kind of fired him without actually like having the emotional maturity to sit down and talk about what was really happening. And that hurt Dave a lot, obviously.
But it also
like
made
that.
great music.
For sure. It did. It did.
If Megadeth wasn't born out of spite and revenge, it wouldn't be what it is now.
Yeah, you're right.
And I think like if they realized what Curtis is going through, then nobody'd be talking about Joy Division right now.
It could be. So I mean, he
like that stuff
he
is
kind of suffered for like art and suffered for us, I guess.
Yeah, And even like if Hendrix was putting out records in the 80s, I think they'd suck.
Yeah.
I'd
like to think he might be like Prince, where it's like hit or miss.
I hope so, but I think it's like at this point, it's just like that stuff
would he just
so
be like
incredible.
phoning it in like the Rolling Stones or Clapton,
or he'd like go through his Fat Hendrix phase and wear jumpsuits and play in Las Vegas or something.
Yeah, I mean,
like who's to know, really?
I know that like Bo Hansen wanted to work with Hendrix, which I think would have been really fascinating, and Miles wanted him to join his fusion stuff in the 70s, and so it's who knows? I mean, it's It's kind of like
I appreciate how things are, how they were left, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
And you kind of realize how special that stuff was.
Sure. It's better to burn out and fade away, as Neil Young said.
Yeah. He's still kicking though.
Yeah. But you know, this development of like the seizures and things like that, I mean, it was just bleak music. And you can hear a little bit of that in that song that we just played from Neurosis's debut. And I know you're a much bigger Pain of Mind fan.
I mean, I haven't
spent that much time recently with it. Yeah.
But I never really I don't think I appreciated how like listenable and like enjoyable that stuff was. It wasn't just like straight ahead stuff.
No, it's not just like crazy obnoxious like crust
bass
stuff.
Bass playing is so fucking good. Like that's what really stands out.
Yeah, especially in that song we just heard, Black. I mean, the bass line, it's very like melancholic and things like that. In the way that you can hear the Joy Division in that song, Black. You know, and I think one of the things that made Joy Division so incredible was their unique kind of bass lines and things like that. The way it was recorded and
that was
put
kind
together.
of almost the through line of all the songs too.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, you get like, you know, I wrote that the early record always gets cast in this like discharge kind of camp, but then you hear a song like Black and you go, oh, all right, they're already even in 1988 they're thinking about avant stuff and art kind of stuff. You know, it's filtering through them a little bit, you know.
I don't know what year they figured out that this was like the band was like their kind of like lifeline. Yeah. But you can, if you kind of go in listening with that in mind, I think you can really kind of start to discover like, oh shit, that's why Through Silver sounds like it does.
Yes.
That's why Enemy of the Sun sounds like it does. Like these, and as Steve mentioned earlier, it's like, this is the music we had to make to save ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is a composite of all these things that were sort of built. There's DNA from all of this stuff inside Through Silver, you know? Another band that we're not playing, but we should kind of like name check because I think they're in a lot of ways they're kind of contemporaries of Joy Division, but they survive obviously, and then they kind of go off in their own unique directions. Is Killing Joke? I think those two bands were, you know, both tremendously influential, especially how they both approach things like the rhythmic propulsion aspect, the bass playing and rhythm sections, you know, were pretty
unconventional instrumentation stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And there's, you know, some kind of gothy, dark kind of cloud elements to some of the stuff they're doing, a little bit of electronic experimentation. I mean, you know, Killing Joke kind of got into like 80s new wave sort of beats at certain points. And I mean, Joy Division turned into New Order and did that too. So like, that was a natural trajectory of some of those bands, you know what I mean? Think about Paradise Lost kind of did that too. Yeah. In a weird way.
I think
you know,
like punk is like rudimentary as it sounds. It's all just about like emotional honesty. Yeah. And I think as you progress as a musician, of course, the next step is going to be going from punk rock music to new wave. Yeah. Because it's more refined. You understand your instrument better. You can further focus your, like what you're trying to, you know, emotionally say in your music. And then, from there, like the 4AD stuff and the goth kind of scene and like the Cure, like all that stuff is just like, holy shit. Yeah. Just all all the stuff seems so obvious that you never noticed before. Yep. Which is like great revelations to have.
That's, I think, what, you know, if there's any kind of DNA or excuse me, there's any thesis to this episode, it's by the end, regardless of what you feel about some of these bands, you know, the samples of Neurosis songs that we're going to kind of, you know, buffet to you and curate to you, you'll hopefully be able to be like, okay, I can start to see where these elements kind of show up and why knowing this stuff helps me appreciate Through Silver a little bit more because it is the culmination of so many different ideas, you know, and it's not, I mean, in a lot of ways, Through Silver is kind of a culmination because the records they make kind of after Through Silver are different, and they're different for survival reasons almost. You know, like the band has kind of almost worked through the stuff they needed to work through.
Well, and that also, that's the record that the lineup's been the same since. Yeah. Yep. And I think that, because they had keyboards previously, but they weren't to the level that they are in Through Silver.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because Noah was a friend, a close friend. So
and they kind of talk about that a little bit, you know. So the next kind of set we're getting into, we're going to start with a kind of an odd band. This is a band that I don't think Mark and I knew much about until Steve talked about them a bit. Although they are in the anarcho punk book from Ian Glasper, which we've been both kind of leafing through and absorbing since we're planning to do some shows with him in the future. And it's a band called Zounds, and they were from Oxford, kind of like you said, anarcho, post-punk kind of thing. They were contemporaries with Crass, and Crass is another band that we're going to be talking about Crass so much, I'm imagining, when we work with Ian. I just figured we don't need to play them here, but we can at least talk about Crass.
Crass has been a band that has been on my radar since like 1990.
Yeah.
As soon as I got into grindcore shit,
they were name checking that stuff.
Always
right?
name checked.
Yeah.
Discharged, Crass.
Well, the first Napalm Death was put out on a Crass bullshit detector.
Yeah,
thing,
exactly.
They're Zounds put their first stuff out on Rough
that
Trade.
Could, eventually, be. Well, we'll probably go into.
Yeah, I think there's
that
gonna be
definitely,
a lot.
but I think there's a lot. Especially, I'm glad to kind of go into that later on, like more mature.
Yeah, I think
to
I can
understand
appreciate
all
it more.
the other context around it too.
Yeah, I think if I tried to understand in the late 90s, early 2000s, pre-internet or at least like early internet, try to like make sense of like anarcho-punk on my own, I would have come out.
You'd have an
not
okay understanding,
it that
but
much.
this
Yeah.
now you're going to have like a nice fresh
Yeah.
baptism in it.
And I can like appreciate how it's not all the same stuff. It's yeah. But I think Crass is as important as, the Sex Pistols and the Clash. They
I
weren't
think
as
they're more
commercially
important as far as heavy or like underground metal is concerned.
for sure. They're more connected to metal. I don't disagree with that.
Like
in
the
way
whole
that
DIY
Discharge
thing
is.
and everything too, yeah.
Absolutely. And again, the DIY thing is so important to a band like Neurosis because regardless of where they're at now and how far they've come from their early punk origins, that DIY DNA is still like kind of part of their ethos. It's always going to sort of be there.
I don't think it ever leaves you. I still even like that's what kind of got. I really liked death metal.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the first kind of music that really outside of thrash that really kind of got me excited. But the fact that you could be a part of the scene without being a musician, that whole DIY thing, like still.
Look at us.
My entire life now.
I played bass a little bit, but I've never been part of a band. But I'm interconnected to like metal for decades now with writing and doing this.
Well,
and
even
it's
with like not having like a traditional job.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can't imagine having. Luckily, like you
like
found
a 9 to 5.
Well, you found a career that really like clicks with your like how everything about you works. Like,
but it's also kind of somewhat non-traditional. Like teaching hours are very fluid, and you can invest as much or as little as you really want, and what I mean.
It's kind of like one of the last bastions of where you can actually have like an impact.
Yeah.
In a big bureaucracy.
Sure. Yeah. Because again, I'm not being micromanaged.
Yeah, I think even more so like high school than college now.
Sure.
Because college is really not what it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I think also I am lucky. It sounds strange, but I'm lucky to teach in a small district too, because I am allowed a certain amount of autonomy.
Well, film classes, history of rock and roll,
because
like
I have nobody to like. It's I don't know. It's like it's a weird catch-22 because you would assume like teaching in like a rural, not super progressive place, like how could I get away with doing this stuff? But it's because if you teach in a bigger district, like everything's way more like controlled and scripted because it has to be. Yes. You also have like more active parents that are more hands-on. There may be, our parents are like, whatever, we're happy to send our kids to a school, they don't. I don't know. They don't question a lot of those. I mean, they question some things. Certainly being a history teacher and teaching like certain classes, I get in trouble with parents a lot, but not because I'm teaching rock and roll history or film, that's not their battles, So, and again, because of the small numbers, I can carve out elective classes that I think at a big school, I don't know if I could run those classes because
I don't think
so many kids have to take the required classes that you need the teachers to teach all that stuff.
Yeah.
So, like we're the last district in Macomb County, and Macomb County has got to be probably top 4 population counties in the state, I imagine, along with like,
easily.
You got Wayne, Oakland, us, and probably where Grand Rapids is at. Maybe Lansing, is in there.
The population density in Wayne.
It's huge.
It's slowly getting smaller.
That's true.
Smaller.
That's true. But like we've got Warren and the bleed into the Sterling Heights and Utica and those. I mean, we have. I think the largest high school in the state of Michigan's in Macomb County. That's Dakota.
Well, that's like 50 years of urban flight.
Of urban flight, exactly. But what I was going to say is, like, we're such a huge county, and my school is the last high school in the county to offer orchestra because every other big school's cut it. You know, so like, again, it's weird because we're the last school you would think that would be progressive in that sort of regard, but because we're almost off everybody's radar screen, and our superintendent allows us to like DIY it a little bit more.
You're kind of insulated from trends too.
Yeah. I think I would hate, I wouldn't hate teaching. I don't think I would ever hate, but I think I'd be more miserable and more burnout if I was teaching like in a big school.
Absolutely.
You know, so I've been able to sort of keep a DIY thing in a weird way, even though I do teach in a bureaucracy, because when I close my door, I control my own environment all day long.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So,
yeah. And I think coming from Mount Pleasant to a slightly smaller school district, I think is a plus too.
I'm like the weird radical, which again, Mount Pleasant's not a radical place to grow up, but we grew up in
college town too, not college town.
Yeah, exactly. So Zounds is this kind of, you know, they're not a band, like when you hear this song, it's probably not you're not immediately going to be like, oh, Neurosis, you know, but I think there's some things in the song like Did He Jump where if you pay attention to some of like the lyrics and things like that, it's, you know, it's kind of talking about some pretty morbid shit. You know, there's this sort of claustrophobic kind of dread that's kind of sprawling throughout the song. It's got like almost a droning feature to it. Steve Lake was the main guy, and he's the bassist and the vocalist. And, you know, some of this you can kind of really tell probably inspired the way that, like, you know, Steve writes songs, you know, with Neurosis and stuff like that. Their big song was a song, I almost played it, but it was more kind of just traditional, crassy kind of sounding. It's called War, Subvert from 1980. But this is a couple years later when I think they're a little bit more interesting, 1981. And so, what was your thoughts? Did you have any? You're new to Zounds. I don't know if you really thought much about. Or
this is the one. My immediate new thing was like, oh, it reminds me of Ned's Atomic Dustbin.
Oh, that's
because
cool.
of the bass playing.
Yeah,
but they were.
But Ned's Atomic kind of fits in a weird category too, right? They're a band that like you guys all grabbed onto. Even Albert talks about them.
Like
you know?
1990 was the Godfather record.
Yeah,
and they had two bass players.
Okay.
And it was like channeling a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it was like kind of a little bit of a resurgence of like kind of punk.
They kind of probably listen to a lot of Killing Joke and Joy Division probably.
Oh, I'm sure.
I feel like.
I'm sure those guys are probably, they're a
little younger.
5 to 7 years older than me or something. But there was like a certain like visceral quality to the propulsiveness of everything that just made me like, that's what got me that's
a cool.
The bass playing, because the guitar was kind of more an accent instrument.
Yeah.
You had two bass players and the drums that kind of like really pushed everything, but
I
kind of weird. The vocals are kind of like Morrissey meets Cramps meets They had that like punk and new wave-ish obviously was the kind of it's antecedent to all this stuff, but it was just kind of a weird little microcosm that works super well that a lot of metal people glommed onto for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so I hadn't even really thought about that, but yeah, you can definitely hear that it's a little more indie rockish elements and stuff like that.
Bouncy bass,
even though it's coming out of the Crass school. It shows that not everybody had to be a Crass clone that came from that kind of scene.
And Crass never sounded the same throughout their career. It was an ethic more than a genre.
Absolutely. I think you're onto that, you know. I think another band to sort of throw into this, you know, around this time, you know, Discharge is clearly influential on Neurosis.
On every heavy band.
Yeah, and I mean, just like even like where the roots of the sludgy stuff kind of comes from, you know, you have Black Flag, My War, side B, which is kind of there. You know, the Melvins was a band that could kind of permeate through parts of this episode. And I think I try to avoid some of the obvious ones a little bit because I think it's kind of fun for us to be able to explore some bands that we'll probably, you know, we're never going to do a Zounds show, you know what I mean? You know, so again, you know, just because we're not talking about those bands or playing them doesn't mean they're not sort of part of it. But, and then we kind of increase the intensity a little bit and we get to 1982. And this is a band I know for sure we're going to be talking about with Ian when we work with him. It's a band called Rudimentary Peni or Peni. Peni, yeah, sorry. Not Bad
Penis.
Penny. We were listening to Bad Penny from frickin' Albini.
Songs about fucking.
Yes, Big Black earlier. I had it in my brain. So, you know, have you heard of them before this? Like, I feel like Napalm talked about them.
I've heard their name before, but nothing made me go out and listen to them.
Yeah.
Until this.
I think I discovered, I'm almost positive, and Brian will know this, I think they're in the History of Heavy Metal Countdown. I think I included them because of just some research. I threw like a song in there, but I didn't really know what the context was. I just knew that they needed to be on there, because they were one of those influential kind of bands or whatever. The thing you have to appreciate about Rudimentary Peni is how unique somebody like Nick Plinko was. And Nick Plinko was the vocalist. I think he's the guitar player too.
Yeah.
And he wrote all the lyrics and things like that. And, I mean, when you think of like something like what Neurosis does, what he did with his lyrics is he goes into these very deep, personal, dark expressions. They're very intense. They're very personal, in a lot of ways. And so I figured the two songs we're going to listen to Cosmetic Plague from the Farce 7-inch in 1982. And then their kind of masterpiece full length is Death Church, which is pretty fucking awesome title, I'll be honest with you, in 1983, and it's a tune called Nothing But a Nightmare. And I came across a book a few years ago before I think even I got that Anarchy book, and I don't know how I got this. I think it was recommended on Amazon or something. I mean, it's reviewed by Kerrang and Maxim Rock and Roll and others. But it's a book called Primal Screamer, and it's written by Nick Plinko. And on the back, it says it's a gothic horror novel about severe mental distress and punk rock. The Primal Screamer is written in the form of a diary kept by a psychiatrist. In the course of his treatment, he gets involved in the UK anarcho-punk scene. It's kind of semi-autobiographical from Plinko. And, they say it's Lovecraft meets Crass in the squats and psychiatric institutions of early 80s England. And, like Kerrang calls it fascinating and compelling. Maximum Rock and Roll says Nick Plinko is a madman. That's not intended as a pejorative opinion, but rather a statement of plain fact. He's...
his algorithms are working really well.
He's a really interesting guy. I haven't read it yet, but I pulled it out when I knew we were going to be covering this band for the Glasper episode soon. And then sure enough, Steve and Noah and others, from the band of Neurosis mentioned how influential this band was. But the lyrics in Cosmetic Plague, I just want to share them because, you might not hear them with these are short, punchy, kind of like, intense, kind of hardcore punk type songs. He says, being honest is no means of survival. Avoid your inner feelings like the plague. This is what it takes to comply with the images. The structure will accommodate, but things aren't what they seem when they're partially hidden. Behind walls of pretense, build for peace of mind. The barriers between us are forever maintained by our acceptance of the roles others choose to define. In a world of competition, life's portrayed as a contest where we're forced to live by making gains at others' expense. But no one's really gaining when perpetual conflict is the result of our relationships based on pretense. We don't need this cultural cosmetic division. It upholds the self-interest on which the system feeds. A deconditioned consciousness of mutual respect is the only way to cure this cosmetic disease.
I was telling Jason off, Mike, this is the song for 2020.
Yeah,
2021.
Yep. We're just the divisions that sort of exist, social media.
I mean, this stuff's always a thing.
Yeah.
It's just like how intense does it get?
Yeah.
And social media is one of those weird things that kind of, it's like
it intensifies everything.
Nobody could ever have guessed.
Yeah.
So like, but those lyrics kind of like seemed incredibly poignant.
Yeah.
At this point in time.
And I think some of that is pointed on him a little bit, and he's kind of self-reflecting a bit, but he is also talking in kind of a social context stuff. And I think you point out something that's interesting, that Neurosis, they talk about very, very personal things, but they almost do it like abstractly or indirectly. Like they're working,
larger
they're working
ideas.
through it, in different ways. They're using like mythology or like metaphor, and a lot of people do that, obviously.
Philosophy. They're not, none of the lyrics are really very literal.
Yeah, they're not I or we or me or anything like that. But I think they take some of the intense, like reflective qualities of a band like Rudimentary Peni and what Plinko's doing. And I think that it's kind of built into some of the DNA, let alone even some of the musical stuff like in, Nothing But a Nightmare that we're going to hear some of the bass playing. you're going to hear that same exact bass playing from David, especially in Reasons to Hide, which will another Pain of Mind song that we'll sort of end this set with. And so before we go into it, I guess one last song, and this one's a little bit more, I think, pointed probably at Plinko or kind of, looking in a mirror of society a little bit. This is Nothing But a Nightmare. And he says, what's the point of living in your mindless life? What's the point of living in your mindless life? What's the point of dying in your mindless death? What's the point of living in your lifeless mind? Have you ever even had the thought of thinking, or is it you're just ignorant? Have you ever even had the thought of thinking? Pathetic fool trapped inside your brain. The pile of shit inside your brain in which you live is not your own. You live out all the lies you're given. You're too scared to face yourself. You're too scared to face yourself. You're too scared to please yourself. Living in your dream world is nothing but a nightmare. Nothing but a nightmare. I mean, I
think if people like really heard those lyrics, I think abroad, if it wasn't done in punk rock, I think that would make a lot of people just kind of like quiver into a ball and just fucking weep.
Yeah, that's bleak shit. I mean,
there's so much honesty to it. It's like
it's like one of the harshest personal critiques I've heard in a song. That self-doubt. I mean, I wrote it's almost like self-flagellation. Like the flagellates in history that would like bleed themselves and try and purify the sin out of them.
Yeah.
And you get to songs like Purify when we get to Through Silver, and it's like I think Neurosis is trying to work out things and issues, whether it's through lyrics or just the music or whatever. I think
these lyrics point out a really like that. That's a very Neurosis sentiment.
Yeah.
Not as direct as that, but as far as the whole idea behind it.
That's what I mean. I think it's the aesthetic of it, or the intellectual
honesty
idea, or quality behind it.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. We've got the Zounds tune from The Curse of Zounds from 1981. It's Did He Jump? Then we've got this pair of rudimentary Peni tunes, one from the Farce 7-inch called Cosmetic Plague, and then the lyrics we just read, Nothing But a Nightmare from Death Church, and then we'll end with another tune from Pain of Mind called Reasons to Hide from Neurosis.
Which no one read. In desperate hand, the note just said, never turn my back on society. Society turned its back on me. Never tried once to drop out. I just couldn't get in from the very start. The children all played clever games. The grown-ups gave them clever names. Turned them all from very young onto the drug competition. Feed them TV every day. Teach them just how they should play. For the ones that start to stray, cut them off till they obey. To want to have to stand and fight. Bully boys all could pick upon a lonely little kid. The grown-ups He found it hard to socialise, 'cause when he laughed, when he cried, in the wrong place, he'd be chastised. An idiot to be despised. Never learned to play the game the way that you're supposed to play. Never learned the things to say, or lock emotions safe away. Who was that on the window ledge? Or did he jump, or was he pushed? He left a note which no one read. In desperate hands the note just said, never turn my back on society. Society turned its back on me. All the world cannot be wrong. It must be me, I don't belong. All the world cannot be wrong. It must be me, I don't belong. All the world cannot be wrong. It must be me, I don't belong. All the world cannot be wrong. It must be me, I don't belong. All the world cannot be wrong. It must be me, I don't belong. The unfree child is full of worry. To the unfree adult he will grow. And unfree children of his own. On and so it goes. Take your hands from off your genitals. Eat those greens and grow up strong. Don't piss yourself, it's very naughty. Stephen, don't you shine. Don't speak now, we are talking. Not a word lest you disgrace. There's people listening, don't embarrass us. Never let us catch you masturbate. When I was a baby, my mummy told me if I was a bad boy, daddy would scold me. When I was a baby, my mummy lectured. If I was a good boy, I would be rewarded. Mummy, daddy, am I what you expected? In your eyes, am I to be respected? Did you want me or just want a reflection of the values that you hold and the way you see them? My mummy's gone, place where I can't go. Place that's cloaked in the mystery of corporate identity. Supermarkets and 3-piece suites. My mum is gone. My mum is gone. When I was a little girl, my mummy told me had to make an effort to make myself pretty. Gotta get a husband, gotta have a baby, gotta be a credit to the rest of the family. Mummy, daddy, am I what you expected? In your eyes, am I to be respected? Did you want me or just want a reflection of the values that you hold and the way you see them? My mum is gone, place where I can't go. Place that's closed in the mystery of corporate identity. Supermarkets and 3-piece suites. My mum is gone. My mum is gone. Now that I'm older, I know the juice got me. I don't hold it against you, though it damaged me sorely. Know that you're a victim, just like me. You can feel the pressure, just like me. Mummy, daddy, am I what you expected? In your eyes, am I to be respected? Did you want me or just want a reflection on the values that you hold and the way you see them? My mum is gone.
That was Reasons to Hide from Neurosis' Pain of Mind. Then we had a pair of Rudimentary Peni songs, Nothing But a Nightmare, Cosmetic Plague. And then we started off with the Zounds. Did he jump? Did he jump, in fact. I like how intense, we didn't really talk about the lyrics, but like the weird story that he tells on that, like it just gets like more and more and more intense, which a lot of Neurosis songs kind of do too. You know, it's like kind of builds and builds. He makes like these weird references to like, you know, being judged for like masturbation. It's like a weird like descent into like this one person's like mind, you know. It's kind of crazy. So we're gonna keep the train kind of running there, but Reasons to Hide, that's you know, another tune from Pain of Mind. And the one thing I pointed out, and Mark and I were talking about it like earlier when we were kind of doing our pre-prep or something, is you really notice the bass sound of Dave and it's very much coming in similarity to like the Rudimentary kind of sound, whatever that is, that sort of, it's not a walking bass, but it definitely stands out more than a lot of punk rock bass does.
I mean, it's a driving bass. Like it's not gallop, but I think there's a lot of similarities with Harris. Yeah. As far as how like prominent in the mix, the rhythm section really is. The drums and the bass, I think, is like, I know I was just watching the early Iron Maiden, the early years documentary.
Yeah, that's great.
A couple nights ago. I love both of those. It's a 2-part thing. Mm-hmm. But they cannot get Steve to admit that punk. Yeah, I know. Punk had an influence on him.
It's so clear.
It's absolutely, even other guys in the band say it's clear.
I remember that. It reminds me of like the time where I remember interviewing Anathema in like the Judgment, like that kind of era. And I think I brought up like, I definitely Porcupine Tree, and they denied having ever heard Porcupine Tree. And then you listen to like their last records, so like the last 3 or 4, and you're like maybe. I'm not gonna say no that you know, but maybe he was being coy.
I know people have like certain like predispositions to not like stuff because of what's happened in the past. Like our friend Chris has a real problem with Kiss. Mm-hmm. It's almost like he can't even. I try to like psychoanalyze it.
Yeah,
it's like what could be so bad that you wouldn't even ever give it a chance?
Yeah,
like, I mean, I can't think of anything in my own life that's so. Maybe I just haven't had that experience, but it was so off-putting that I could never even try to reevaluate it in a different context.
Yeah,
and maybe that's a personality thing. It's not a judgment call. It's just I'm trying to understand because I want to see the value of anything.
I think for me, it might be maybe Bro Country. Like I've been around it enough teaching Armada that like I don't have any like
that you're going into something that has no value whatsoever.
I couldn't really like cultivate anything out. I can even like cultivate like pop country, especially maybe female stuff, like because at least I can get behind like female vocals a little. But
look, Shania Twain, there's something undeniable about the songwriting and Mutt Lange and AC/DC and all that kind of
But
shit,
like I just it's like frat guy stuff. I just can't do it. You know, when it's coming from like that, like
but if it's like something that's kind of like part of the scene anyway, and like
I was gonna say, if it's part of the DNA of the story that you enjoy and you're part of, you know, the fact that like everybody grew up listening to Kiss and started bands.
I used to think Dokken was stupid, and I completely turned my
you just kind of reevaluate stuff.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you know my policy. I'm pretty fucking open about stuff. We're pretty
on the same page about that stuff. But I always find it funny when people are just like, no. Even with we're talking with Steve, like prog rock.
Yeah,
is not a thing that
he got pretty. And then I was like, well, like King
that's
Crimson.
Debatable.
Yeah. He's like, and I get it because he's probably been. I mean, if you've just kind of like had to listen to like Emerson, Lake and Palmer a whole bunch and that kind of shit, like you just you're not really like it's like tiring, you know.
But I love old Genesis.
Yeah, but that stuff's kind of artsy too. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I think so. You know,
so I never say no. Like I always like to hear people's opinion before I'm like, oh, okay.
That could be too, just because of like their roots in being like DIY punk. Like it's almost anathema to them. Yeah, like that's like,
and for them to be disparagingly called prog.
Yes, and I bet they probably have.
Well, they mentioned in the interview.
Yeah. That's true.
The maximum rock and roll thing.
That's true. Yeah, call them. Yeah.
Like.
Yeah, you're missing the boat.
I guess in punk rock terms, maybe that's a real broad brush there, but that's like a derogatory brush too.
I mean, people have used that term, I think, to like box like Tool or something like that modern day, and people have their own opinions on Tool and whatever. I'm not going to go there. I personally like Tool. I'm interested in them. Do I always listen to them? No, but like whatever. I appreciate that they took something that in the mid '90s that seemed kind of like a tired formula, like whatever the grungy kind of that sound, and like kind of did something kind of fairly interesting with it.
They had an undeniable effect on everything heavy.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't deny that.
So you can hate on them, and they might not be your flavor, but like some people are like, that's just like prog. It's like, I think they're doing something else too. You know? I think they kind of
do like Yes too.
Yeah. I like what a great who's the bass player, Chris. I can't think of his name. He's incredible.
It's not like it doesn't. I have every Rush record.
Yeah, I mean, I love Rush. Yeah,
and I was talking with the lady friend about Rush, and she was like, "Oh no," it's like I got every fucking Rush record, and if you got anything to say about it, maybe we'll talk about something else.
It's like I Love You, Man. When Paul Rudd and Jason Segel are, like the fiance or the wife is like, oh.
It's like
Rush is definitely not a girls' band.
No, if you ever watch Beyond the Lighted Stage and you don't love that band, there's something wrong with you.
I want to hug them.
That's
like great guys, man.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, these are my buddies, and we made some great shit together.
I recently got into like the first like 3 Chicago records because that's when they were like doing like like almost like Hendrix-y type stuff, especially the guitar playing. I can't think of his name. It's just completely
definitely
escapes
not Peter
me.
Cetera, but
It's not. Peter Cetera kind of ruined the band in the 80s. I didn't realize he was not really a big part of the band.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't even really like the main vocalist.
Steve's going to be real pissed if he hears us talk about Chicago.
I know. All right. Sorry, Steve. We got a little prog rock sort of thing. But
we're willing to listen to everything and give it its due. So.
Speaking of Chicago, Amoebics.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Speaking of Chicago.
Yeah. So no, I'm just kidding.
I thought you were going to go into Steve Albini.
No. Just Amoebics is like about as far from Chicago, the band, as you'll sort of get. So
speaking of the Isle of Man and Swords, here comes Amoebics.
Amoebics is they're a band I've sort of been into through the years, but I don't think I have the context to like kind of completely, sort of appreciate them. They were a band that was obviously coming out of like the Crass thing. They were inspired by it, but they're also like some of their hugest influences were like Bauhaus, Joy Division, Killing Joke. So they're bringing those aspects in. And then there's just this other undeniable layer. And, I did some research on them for the future, Glasper Anarcho kind of episode. And, they like Sabbath and things like that, but they claim that they were not inspired by like Venom and some of that kind of stuff. But when you hear a song like Sunshine Ward from 1983 from the No Sanctuary, which I believe came out on Alternative Tentacles. I think this is after they met Jello. I think he put that out. Maybe. He put out one of the records. It was Arise. It's Arise.
Arise,
yeah. Sorry. So they meet Jello right after No Sanctuary. But I mean, this riff that you're going to hear in Sunshine Ward is like, it's like Dark Throne.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
I
it's
remember like
intense.
I got into Amoebics probably like in probably like 10, 11 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there was a YouTube documentary that I was watching about them. And what really stood out to me was their bass. I think it was Stig who was talking about, like, we didn't realize that you had, like, you get guitars, but we didn't realize you had to tune them.
Yeah.
So that kind of like naivete, I think, really affected their sound in like a profound, great way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of the bands we're kind of discussing have that little bit. None of them are like virtuosos by any stretch of the imagination. It's like the emotion that comes through the instruments. And even Steve and Noah talk about that a little bit, that they were kind of primitive on their instruments, but what came through was honest and real.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's not much frill in Neurosis. They might repeat things, but like you're not getting like kind of show offy guitar solos. That's never a thing.
No solos.
That's never a feature, you know. But like you can tell they're incredible musicians. But they're incredible musicians because they almost like built their own knowledge on their own.
Yeah.
In the same way that like, I always bring this back because I think it was the first interview I ever read when I was younger that mentioned something like this, like Stephen Carpenter from Deftones being like, I don't know how to play guitar, but I just sort of like did this sound and just kind of kept doing that.
Well, he figured
sound.
out drop D, and then he could like kind of go from there, because that's like it's knocking down the, like, you don't need to learn how to play, like an Eric Clapton thing.
Yeah,
you can just like, here's a tuning. Now go for it.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
It's almost like, sometimes you have to unlearn stuff in order to like truly like be creative.
I mean,
you know,
Yoda was pretty wise.
He was wise. Yeah. And that Buddhist philosophy will get us to the next band I'm going to talk about actually too. But yeah, I mean, they're like, you know, again, Amoebics, DIY, Anarcho, they were really into this. They were probably amongst the most like outspoken about kind of the brutality of like the squatting lifestyle. Like they were the ultimate like kind of squatting band, if you will.
I don't know if anybody really understands how prolific that was.
It's all over the Anarcho book when you get a chance to read it.
And I knew like some squatters like in like the Detroit area.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand how like prolific it was in the UK.
Sure. And it has a lot to do with complex economics, and I'm sure Ian can give us some context into that. I'm kind of curious to sort of see. But you know, they were doing this unique kind of, I think, textured kind of heavy music that I said is really almost unlike any of their peers at this time. You know, maybe Hellhammer in a weird way was doing something kind of similar, coming from a completely different place and stuff. But like,
I think they're coming from the same place, but from different influences.
Yeah, I was gonna say Hellhammer's not coming from Anarcho.
They're
crass.
coming from Venom.
Yeah, they're coming from
Discharge.
Exactly. You know, so I think you can listen to the song like Sunshine Ward, which, you know, it has this sort of dark, melancholic kind of metallic textures, especially in the opening. It's very gothic tinge, you know, early Cure even in this. And then I said the song takes a sinister heel turn when really about after like a minute and a half or so, you get this like complete black metal riffery and also these piercing shrieks, which are pretty unsettling in a weird way.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff Neurosis is going to do, where like they just hit you with like sounds cutting through you, you know, whether it's keyboard things, samples like layered in and stuff. And again, they're not doing any production layering here. This is not what I'm not comparing that, but I'm saying like using like these weird aesthetic choices to sort of like break you down a little bit and create a little bit more terrorizing experience. You know?
Yeah. I think that, that Kelly's scream is the most honest thing I've ever heard in music.
It's pretty good.
It's like, and then that's why I think all the songs that he's done like 6 or 7 songs with Mastodon.
Yeah.
And when the first time I remember hearing, Through Silver was the first thing that kind of affected me because I was there when it came out at the record label. And also, you know, I was going through some personal shit too. So I think it even maybe connected a little bit more.
Yeah.
But Scott's scream, like Steve's was like firm, but Scott's was like, it was like opening up a wound.
Mm-hmm.
It was aggressive, but it was also just like, Jesus, it like I kind of felt it to the bone.
The only person I wrote down that kind of compares, and maybe not necessarily with Scott, but like that kind of shrieking, like kind of visceral sort of nature, is I said, Disrupt when Alicia.
Yeah.
You know, like you're just like, it's disarming in a way. Like, and again, I've heard some pretty brutal screams. I mean, we started with one with Pink Floyd, but like, that's like a next level kind of thing. Yeah. You know, it's coming from like a completely weird place, you know?
Yeah. And Pink Floyd's using it for effect, but then, you know, like using it as like the entire like landscape that you're using to kind of talk, you know, use your emotions. It's kind of crazy.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
And then we get into a band that I don't think Mark and I were too familiar with, called Rune. They were a Philly band.
I've never heard of them at all.
You know, and he mentioned them in the interview we heard earlier, and they were sort of the first Buddhist hardcore kind of punk band before like, the Krishna core stuff happened in the 90s with like Shelter and stuff like that. I think the only band that was probably in that particular scene that was maybe exploring spirituality was like Bad Brains with like Rastafarian kind of stuff that HR was maybe talking about. Yeah. But I think a band like Neurosis is probably less interested in Rastafarianism and I think more interested in kind of spiritual, like Eastern philosophy and mythology and the sort of ancient religions and ancient belief systems. And, you know, speaking of Yoda, you know, unlearning before you can learn, you know, that kind
Yoda's
of,
a Buddha master. But.
And I think, you know, it's combining some of those aspects with heavy music. And I think that makes a really immediate connection. And that's, I think, why Steve and Noah mentioned them being like a big influence on them. Not necessarily because of how Rune necessarily sounds. But again, I think maybe just the idea of like combining some elements that probably weren't part of like most punk bands or most hardcore bands at that time.
Yeah, I think, they were kind of pulling in the ideas they wish to kind of like get to.
Yeah, like let's explore some deeper things here.
If like a band, like something about them grabs you and then you find out that they're kind of like on the search to kind of figure themselves out too. I think that's why that whole like indie rock phase in our college career kind of like stuck so hard, because it was going to a different area that like metal didn't really do until Catatonia and Anathema came around and kind of started like wetting that.
I think those bands kind of got me personal. It was more personal with some of those bands in a way, you know.
Yeah, because like the gore lyrics and stuff, that's cool and fine.
It's like horror movies. It's fine,
whatever.
You know?
But after at a certain point, you want more, and then once you get that quenched, then you can appreciate the other stuff more. I think.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's weird. Like Catatonia got me to like appreciate the Cure more, and you know things like that. Like those are bands I knew, but like
the Cure always
they were like
since I was like a teenager. There's always these touchstone moments that keep coming back, like when Tribulation did 10,000 Years.
Yeah.
Like it always comes back like, okay, this band is really important.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's been important in my life for 35 years now.
It's weird because you were 4 years ahead of me. So I think you would have had a more natural like footing in the Cure. I was a little too young. But like girls did like them. But by the time I came about in middle school, the Cure's phase was kind of done.
They were kind of in their poppy kind of.
They were even like beyond that though.
Yeah.
Like Love Song and all that stuff was like when I was in elementary school. Whereas you were in like middle school, early high school, maybe right when like I was in.
Well, Disintegration's the one that was really the big deal for in high school. But.
Sure. But again, I was like sixth grade.
Yeah.
No one in sixth grade was talking about no one I knew was talking about that, you know. I mean,
there's some weird kid that wasn't talking about it, but
I mean, I remember like hearing Friday I'm in Love on MTV and stuff and being like, cool, but like I didn't know what the context of that was or whatever, you know. So like as I got older, I appreciated bands I think I missed in the 80s, like the Smiths, Killing Joke, you know, The Cure, Joy Division, things like that.
Yeah.
That I think a generation that was older than me they just absorbed that in their DNA because it was just around them, whether they were fans or not. You know, they were aware of it. So
it was because it was a stratified kind of like there was the punk kids, there was the metal kids, there was the new wave-ish goth people, and like I was kind of friends with a lot of different. I wasn't like just in one kind of circle.
I knew those kids. They were a little bit older than me. I knew a few of them. They were probably kids you influenced because you were, you know. Amber and Blythe and those kind of people. Like I knew who they were, but I didn't get to know them till I was a little bit older, you know?
Yeah. Cause that whole kind of crowd they kind of approached stuff at a different entry point. Like we were thrash to death metal and then, you know, back to Ministry to, you know, back to Butthole Surfers and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And they started kind of like at Butthole Surfers and would kind of like reinforce that idea.
Yeah. And I think that's something like that I got from like, probably like certain members of Neurosis, their entry point was through punk. You know, some people's entry points to heavy music is through metal. Some people, you know, like, so everybody's got a different doorway, and then you have to like cycle back and find what those other doorways were that also got people there. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of cool. So, but yeah, I think Rune, you know, some of the things I noticed in some of the songs, we're going to play the eponymous tune from Fiat Lux from 86. And but things I noticed in other Rune songs when I was kind of checking them out was I heard some like kind of cool discordant uses and stuff, which you didn't always hear that in like traditional hardcore at that time.
It's a Philly band too. They don't.
Yeah,
they kind of sound more UK than
a little bit
their contemporaries
for sure. And again, they're kind of singular, and I think that's like the word of the day is singular. You know. And speaking of singular, the next band we're going to play from Rune is Beefeater, and this is a band that I know next to nothing about other than when they were on Discord, you know, and some of those like mid 80s like Discord bands like Rites of Spring and there's a few others. I knew Rites of Spring pretty well, but like they were like kind of part of this like different scene that wasn't Minor Threat, you know, and it certainly wasn't yet Fugazi. It was like that in between phase between Minor Threat and Fugazi almost. It's kind of like we have a mutual friend of ours named Chris True, and he's like very Discord oriented, and he kind of taught me a lot about Discord type stuff. So I never talked to him about Beefeater. I'm curious what his thoughts are on him, but you know, they've got some kind of gang of four kind of Fishbone kind of funk leanings that you'll hear in a song like this. You know, not so much Red Hot Chili Peppers funk leanings. You know, maybe they're punk phase a little, but I haven't really spent time with those 80s Chili Pepper records because I don't care that much to.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
But again, this is a really singular band. This is unlike almost anything else we're playing in this episode. And I'm not really sure, other than Steve mentioning them, like what, you know, if he's directly pulling anything from Beefeater. I don't know enough about them, but I think they're an interesting band to like kind of present to people as being this kind of left of center potential influence on a band like Neurosis.
Yeah, just like showing them like what the possibility. Like you don't have to be X, Y, or Z. You can be whatever the fuck you want.
Well, and then the song kind of descends into like a John Zorn kind of Naked City kind of like, there's like free jazz kind of elements and stuff like that. So it's kind of all over the place. And so let's get into it. And then we'll talk about the stuff we're going to play at the end of the set when we kind of come back. But we've got Sunshine Ward from Amoebix's No Sanctuary. We've got Rune from the Fiat Lux record in 86. Song for Lucky from Beefeater's Pray for Lovers from 1985. Then we're going to end with a Die Kreutzen song from Oktoberfile and another Neurosis song from The Word is Law. We'll talk about those when we come back.